When my son Marcus stood in my living room and demanded I start paying him $200 monthly rent or get out in 30 days, I realized the grateful boy I'd sacrificed everything to raise had become a stranger driven by greed. But what Marcus didn't know was that the broke old lady he was trying to evict had spent 40 years building one of the most successful catering empires in the state, and the business empire I'd secretly been planning would soon teach him exactly why you should never underestimate a mother's love or a woman's quiet determination. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had family turn on you when you least expected it. Make sure you're subscribed, because this story of how one mother's strategic patience turned her son's cruelty into the biggest lesson of his life will leave you speechless. My name is Margaret Chen, and at 70 years old, I thought I knew everything there was to know about heartbreak. I'd buried my husband David 3 years ago after 42 years of marriage. I'd watched my small catering business that we'd built together from our kitchen table grow into something I was proud of, then sold it to spend David's final years focused on what truly mattered, time with the man I loved. I'd navigated the strange, hollow feeling of widowhood, where every morning you wake up reaching for someone who's no longer there. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the cold. Calculation in my only child's eyes as he stood in my modest riverside home on a gray Tuesday morning in October, holding papers he'd clearly had prepared by a lawyer. I was in my kitchen, making Marcus his favorite blueberry pancakes just like I had every Tuesday for the past 3 years since David's passing. It had become our tradition. Marcus would stop by before work, we'd have breakfast together, and for an hour I could pretend I still had family who cared whether I lived or died. The kitchen smelled like butter and vanilla. The coffee was brewing in David's old percolator, and I was humming softly to myself, grateful for these small moments of connection with my son. The morning light streamed through the yellow curtains I'd sewn 30 years ago, illuminating the family photos that lined the windowsill. Pictures of Marcus's first day of school, his high school graduation, his wedding to Sarah 5 years ago. Photos of David and me building this life together, brick by brick, meal by meal, dream by dream. This kitchen had been the heart of our home, where homework was done at the scarred wooden table, where birthday cakes were frosted with extra love, where family decisions were made over steaming cups of coffee and plates of homemade food. "Mom, we need to talk," Marcus said as he entered, but his tone was different, formal, distant. There was no kiss on the cheek, no compliment about the pancakes, no asking how I'd slept. Instead, he remained standing while I gestured toward his usual chair at the small dining table David had built with his own hands 30 years ago. I noticed he was wearing his expensive gray suit, the one Sarah had insisted he buy for important meetings, rather than his usual casual work clothes. His hair was perfectly styled, his briefcase polished leather instead of the worn canvas bag he'd carried for years. When had my son started looking more like a corporate lawyer than the warm-hearted boy who used to help me knead bread on Sunday mornings? "Of course, sweetheart," I said, plating his pancakes with the extra blueberries he'd always loved. "Sit down, breakfast is ready. You look tired. Has work been stressful?" Marcus didn't sit. He didn't even look at the food I'd prepared with such care, rising at 6 a.m. to make everything perfect for his arrival. Instead, he pulled out a manila folder and set it on the table with the kind of precision that reminded me uncomfortably of serving legal papers. The folder was thick, official-looking, the kind that meant business rather than family. "Mom, I've been doing some thinking, and I've made some decisions about our arrangement here. Our arrangement. Not visiting Mom. Not spending time together. Not taking care of family. An arrangement." The word hit me like a slap, cold and transactional, reducing 3 years of shared grief and mutual support to something that sounded like a business contract. I set down the syrup pitcher carefully, a cold feeling creeping up my spine like morning frost. "What kind of decisions, Marcus?" He opened the folder with the efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed this moment, pulling out what looked like a rental agreement typed on official letterhead. His movements were precise, controlled, as if he'd practiced this conversation in front of a mirror. "I've been carrying a lot of financial burden since Dad died. This house, your expenses, the upkeep, it's more than I can handle as a gift anymore. I need you to start contributing $200 a month in rent, or I'll need you to find somewhere else to live." The words hit me like a physical blow, so unexpected and cruel that for a moment I wondered if I'd heard him correctly. I gripped the back of David's chair, the chair where he'd sat for thousands of meals, where he'd helped Marcus with homework, where he'd held my hand during his final weeks at home, and stared at my son as if he'd started speaking a foreign language. "Rent. Marcus, this is my home. Your father and I bought this house when you were 5 years old. We raised you here. Every room in this house holds memories of our family, of the life we built together." My voice was barely above a whisper, but I could hear the tremor in it. This kitchen, where I was standing, was where I'd thrown Marcus his 6th birthday party, when David was deployed and couldn't be there. The living room beyond held the Christmas tree where we'd opened presents every December 25th for 35 years. The basement was where David had taught Marcus to use tools, where they'd built the treehouse that still stood in our backyard. How could he reduce all of that to a monthly payment? "Actually," Marcus said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone I'd never heard from him before, the kind of voice people use when explaining simple concepts to children or the elderly. "If you check the deed, the house has been in my name for the past 18 months. You signed the papers yourself, remember? For estate planning purposes, you said, to avoid probate complications." I did remember. Marcus had brought the papers right here to this same table, spreading them out next to my morning coffee, explaining that it was just a formality, a way to make sure the house stayed in the family, without legal hassles if something happened to me. Sarah had been with him that day, sitting quietly in the corner, watching as I signed document after document with complete trust in my son's guidance. "It's just paperwork, Mom," he'd said then, his voice warm and reassuring. "Nothing changes except we avoid the lawyers and taxes if something happens. The house stays in the family, just like you and Dad always wanted." I'd trusted him completely, signed without even reading the fine print because he was my son, my only child, the boy I'd given everything to raise. What parent doesn't trust their child when they say they're protecting the family's interests? "That was supposed to be for estate planning," I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper as the full scope of what had happened began to dawn on me. "You said it wouldn't change anything about me living here. You promised me nothing would change." Marcus shrugged, a gesture so callous and dismissive it took my breath away. It was the kind of shrug you give when discussing the weather, not when destroying your mother's sense of security and belonging in her own home. "Plans change, Mom. I've got a family to think about now. Sarah and I are expecting our second child. The kids need college funds, and frankly, maintaining 2 households is financially irresponsible. You're 70 years old, living alone in a 4-bedroom house. It doesn't make practical sense." Sarah, his wife of 5 years, a woman who'd smiled sweetly at family dinners while making subtle comments about how much space I was wasting and how valuable the property had become in Riverside's booming real estate market. A woman who'd never liked that Marcus still came for our Tuesday breakfasts, who'd complained that I was too dependent on him for emotional support, who'd suggested more than once that I might be happier somewhere with people my own age. I'd tried to like Sarah. Truly, I had. When Marcus first brought her home, I'd welcomed her with open arms, desperate to expand our small family circle after David's death. I'd shared family recipes, included her in holiday traditions, offered to help with wedding planning, but Sarah had a way of making me feel like an intruder in my own home, always checking her phone when I spoke, always finding reasons why they couldn't stay long, always mentioning how much work it was to maintain such a big house. "Marcus," I said, trying to keep my voice steady even as my world tilted on its axis, I understand money is tight with the new baby coming, but surely we can work something out. Maybe I could help with the children, or contribute in other ways. I could— Help with what? He interrupted. And for the first time, I heard actual contempt in his voice. Contempt directed at me, his mother, the woman who'd worked 16-hour days to pay for his education, who'd sacrificed her own dreams to ensure he had every opportunity. Mom, let's be realistic here. You're living on Social Security and Dad's pension. You don't have $200 a month to spare. You don't have any real income, any assets worth mentioning. The catering business is long gone, and you've been coasting on Dad's life insurance for 3 years. Coasting. As if the modest life I'd built in widowhood was somehow a moral failing. As if the decision to sell my successful catering company to care for David in his final illness had been selfish rather than loving. As if the choice to spend his last months holding his hand instead of chasing profits was something to be ashamed of. The catering business hadn't been just any business. Chen's Catering had employed 47 people at its peak, had exclusive contracts with the city's most prestigious venues, had catered everything from intimate wedding receptions to corporate events for 5,000 people. I'd built it from nothing, starting with dinner parties for David's colleagues, growing it meal by meal, client by client, until it was generating over $2 million annually. But when David was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, when the doctors said he had maybe 18 months, I'd made a choice. I'd sold the business to my longtime manager, Patricia Winters, for far less than it was worth because I wanted it to go to someone who understood its heart and soul. I'd used the money to make David's final months as comfortable and meaningful as possible. Trips to places we'd always wanted to see, time with family, the luxury of my undivided attention during his hardest days. It had been the right choice then, and it was still the right choice now. But apparently, my son saw it as evidence of my financial irresponsibility rather than proof of my priorities. I have some savings, I said quietly, though even as I spoke, I could see the dismissal in Marcus's eyes. Marcus's laugh was harsh, the kind of laugh that cuts rather than warms. Mom, I've seen your bank statements when I helped you with your taxes. You've got maybe $30,000 left. That's not savings. That's barely enough to get you into a decent assisted living facility. Assisted living. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. He'd already planned out my entire future, apparently. Not independent living in a small apartment where I could maintain some dignity and autonomy. Not a cozy seniors community where I might make friends and build a new life. Institutional care where I'd be someone else's problem, where my independence would be sacrificed to his convenience. I looked at the rental agreement he'd placed on the table, the same table where we'd done his homework when he was 8 years old, where we'd celebrated his acceptance to college, where we'd planned his wedding, where we'd shared thousands of meals as a family. The monthly amount was written in bold print, $200, due on the 1st of each month, with a 30-day notice period for non-payment. There were additional clauses about maintenance responsibilities, guest policies, utility payments, as if I were a tenant rather than the woman who'd raised him in this house. You've already had this drawn up by a lawyer, I observed, running my finger along the official letterhead. This wasn't a sudden decision made in emotional distress. This was calculated, planned, probably discussed at length with Sarah over dinners I hadn't been invited to. I wanted to make sure everything was legal and proper, Marcus replied, though he had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable under my steady gaze. I'm not trying to hurt you, Mom. I'm just trying to be practical. If you can't afford the rent, there are options. There's a nice senior community about 20 minutes from here, Sunset Manor. I checked and they have availability. It would actually cost less than what I'm asking for rent here. Sunset Manor. I knew the place, a sprawling complex of identical units where elderly people went to wait for death, where activities were scheduled from morning to night to keep residents busy rather than fulfilled, where independence was gradually eroded in the name of safety and convenience. It was clean, well-managed, perfectly respectable. It was also the antithesis of everything David and I had worked to build. A home filled with love, memories, and purpose. And if I refuse? I asked, though I already knew the answer from the careful way he'd prepared his documents. Marcus's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the stubborn little boy who used to cross his arms and set his mouth in exactly that line when he didn't get his way. Then I'll have to start eviction proceedings. Mom, I don't want it to come to that, but I have to think about my family's future. Sarah's going to quit her job after the baby comes, which means we'll be down to one income. We need the rental income from this house, or we need to sell it and find a place that's more financially sensible. Sell it. The words hit me like another physical blow. The house where David had carried me over the threshold as a young bride, nervous and excited about our future together. Where Marcus had taken his first steps, holding on to David's outstretched hands. Where we'd painted nursery walls and built swing sets and hosted birthday parties that spilled out into the backyard. Where David had died peacefully in our bedroom, holding my hand and telling me he loved me one last time. This house wasn't just real estate to be optimized for maximum financial return. It was the repository of our family's history, the foundation upon which we'd built our lives together. Every room held stories. Every corner contained memories that couldn't be replaced or replicated. The scratches on the door frame where we'd measured Marcus's height each birthday. The dent in the wall where he'd thrown a baseball despite being told repeatedly not to play catch in the house. The garden where David and I had planted roses for our 10th anniversary, which bloomed faithfully every spring, like a promise kept. But, as I looked at my son's face, determined, defensive, already distant, I realized that those memories meant nothing to him now. He saw burden where I saw belonging, inefficiency where I saw home. I sat down heavily in my own chair, suddenly feeling every one of my 70 years. The pancakes I'd made with such care were growing cold, the coffee was getting bitter, and the son I'd raised with such love was treating me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be cherished. You've already made up your mind, I said. It wasn't a question. The careful preparation, the legal documents, the researched alternatives. This wasn't a discussion. This was notification. I'm sorry, Mom, but yes. This is the most practical solution for everyone involved. You'll be happier somewhere with people your own age, activities planned for you, medical staff nearby if you need help. And Sarah and I can start fresh here. Make this house a real family home again with children's laughter filling the rooms. A real family home again, as if my presence somehow made it less real, less valid, less worthy of being called home. As if the 35 years David and I had spent building our life here, raising our son here, loving each other here, were somehow inadequate compared to what Sarah and Marcus could create. I folded my hands in my lap, a gesture David used to say, made me look like I was praying. Maybe I was. Praying for strength, for wisdom, for the ability to respond with dignity to this devastating betrayal. How long do I have? 30 days should be plenty of time to make arrangements, Marcus said, his tone softening slightly, perhaps recognizing the devastation in my voice. I know it seems sudden, but it's really for the best, Mom. You'll see. Once you're settled somewhere appropriate, you'll wonder why we didn't do this sooner. For the best. The same words every cruel person uses when they want to avoid admitting their selfishness, when they want to convince themselves that their convenience somehow serves a greater good. I looked at my son, the stranger wearing Marcus's face but speaking with Sarah's words, and made a decision that would change everything. But not the decision he expected. The old Margaret might have begged, might have cried and pleaded and promised to be less of a burden, might have accepted his version of reality and shuffled meekly off to Sunset Manor to spend her remaining years, feeling grateful for whatever scraps of attention her son might occasionally throw her way. But the woman sitting at this table wasn't just Marcus's mother. She was Margaret Chen, the same woman who'd built a catering empire from nothing, who'd negotiated million-dollar contracts, who'd managed staff and satisfied demanding clients, and solved logistical nightmares that would have broken weaker people. I'd just been dormant for 3 years, focused on grief and recovery, and the simple pleasure of Tuesday morning pancakes with my son. Marcus had just woken me up. "All right," I said quietly, my voice steady and calm. "I'll move out." Marcus blinked, clearly having prepared for tears, arguments, desperate bargaining. You will?" "Yes," I said, standing up with more dignity than I felt, smoothing my apron with hands that were steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "If that's what you want, Marcus, then that's what will happen. I'll be out within the week." "Within the week?" Now he looked concerned, perhaps realizing that his careful timeline was being disrupted. "Mom, you don't have to rush. I said 30. Days? You should take the time to find the right place, make proper arrangements." "No," I interrupted, my voice gaining strength with each word. "If I'm not wanted here, then there's no point in prolonging the inevitable. I'll make arrangements. Today." What Marcus didn't understand, what he'd never bothered to learn despite 43 years of being my son, was that when Margaret Chen made a decision, she didn't just make it, she made it strategically, with careful planning, complete commitment, and absolutely no room for half measures. It was a trait that had served me well in business, in marriage, in every major challenge I'd faced throughout my life. And now, apparently, in dealing with ungrateful children who'd forgotten where they came from. As Marcus gathered his papers and prepared to leave, skipping the breakfast I'd prepared with such care, his movements suddenly seeming hurried and uncomfortable, I was already making mental lists, phone calls to make, arrangements to finalize, pieces to move into position for a game he didn't even know had begun. He thought he was evicting a helpless old woman who would beg and plead for mercy, who would accept whatever crumbs he chose to offer. What he was actually doing was waking up a sleeping dragon who'd spent 40 years learning exactly how to build something from nothing, and how to take it all away just as efficiently. "I'll call you when I'm settled," I told him as he reached the door, clutching his briefcase like a shield. "Mom?" Marcus said, turning back with what might have been regret flickering in his eyes, or perhaps just discomfort at how easily I'd accepted his ultimatum. "I know this seems harsh, but you'll understand eventually. This really is what's best. For everyone." I smiled at him then, the same smile I'd used with difficult clients who thought they could intimidate me. The same smile that had closed million-dollar deals and opened doors that seemed permanently locked. It was a smile that promised nothing and threatened everything, though Marcus was too inexperienced to recognize the difference. "I'm sure you're right, sweetheart," I said, my voice warm and maternal and absolutely terrifying to anyone who knew how to listen. "This will definitely be what's best for everyone." He left then, probably relieved that the confrontation had gone more smoothly than expected, already planning how he'd tell Sarah about his successful eviction of his troublesome mother. As his car disappeared down Maple Street, the same street, where he'd learned to ride a bicycle, where he'd run to catch the school bus, where he'd brought dates to meet his parents, I stood in my kitchen and began to plan. Marcus thought he'd solved his financial problems by evicting his mother. What he'd actually done was give me the perfect motivation to show him exactly what he'd thrown away when he chose greed over gratitude, money over family, Sarah's ambitions over his mother's love, and by the time I was finished, he'd understand that the broke old lady he'd dismissed so casually had more power than he'd ever imagined, more resources than he'd ever suspected, and more determination than he'd inherited despite sharing my DNA. The game was about to begin, and my ungrateful son had no idea he was playing against a master. After Marcus left, I stood in my kitchen for exactly 5 minutes, allowing myself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. The betrayal, the calculation. The casual cruelty of a son who'd forgotten that everything he was, everything he'd achieved, had been built on the foundation of his parents' sacrifices. Then I poured myself a cup of David's coffee, still strong and black the way he'd liked. It sat down at our table and began to make a list, because that's what Margaret Chen did when the world tried to knock her down. She got organized, got strategic, and got even. But to understand what I was capable of, what Marcus had unleashed, when he handed me those eviction papers, you need to know who I really was before I became just mom in his eyes. You need to understand the woman David had fallen in love with, the entrepreneur who'd built an empire from nothing, the strategist who'd never lost a battle that truly mattered. My story began 45 years ago, when I was 25 years, old and fresh off the boat, literally. David and I had immigrated from Hong Kong with 2 suitcases, limited English, and unlimited determination. He'd been offered a position as a junior engineer at Portland Construction, a job that would barely cover rent on a 1-bedroom apartment in the city's cheapest neighborhood. I'd had a degree in business administration that American employers looked at with polite skepticism, as if education from anywhere outside their borders was somehow inferior. But what I'd also had was something that couldn't be learned in any classroom: my grandmother's recipes and an understanding of food that went bone deep. In Hong Kong, I'd grown up in my family's restaurant, learning not just how to cook, but how to read people through their appetites, how to make every meal feel like a celebration, how to turn simple ingredients into memories that lasted a lifetime. Our first apartment in Riverside was a cramped space above Mrs. Patterson's bakery on Oak Street. The rent was $340 a month, which seemed impossible on David's $850 monthly salary after taxes. We had exactly $500 left after immigration fees and travel costs. Most people would have seen those numbers and panicked. I saw opportunity. "We're going to start a catering business," I announced to David 3 days after we'd arrived, spreading my grandmother's recipe cards across our tiny kitchen table like a battle plan. David, bless his heart, looked at our empty bank account and our complete lack of professional kitchen equipment and said, "When do we start?" The first Chen's catering event was Mrs. Patterson's daughter's wedding reception. 60 people, $500 budget, to be held in the church basement. I spent our last $200 on ingredients and borrowed every pot, pan, and serving dish I could find. David took a day off work, unpaid because he hadn't accrued vacation time yet, to help me cook and serve. The menu was simple: my grandmother's honey walnut shrimp, beef and broccoli that would make grown men weep, fried rice that somehow tasted like it contained secrets, and egg rolls that were so perfectly crispy they sounded like autumn leaves when you bit into them. For dessert, I made traditional almond cookies alongside a chocolate cake that fused East and West in ways that shouldn't have worked, but absolutely did. When the last guest left that night, Mrs. Patterson handed me an envelope with $500 cash and 5 business cards from people who wanted to hire me for their own events. "Margaret," she said, "I've never seen people eat with such joy. You have a gift." That was the moment I knew we were going to make it in America. The business grew organically, the way the best businesses do, through word of mouth, exceptional quality, and an absolute refusal to compromise on standards. I learned to navigate American business customs while maintaining the authenticity that made our food special. I discovered which flavors translated universally and which needed cultural adaptation. Most importantly, I learned how to read my clients, how to understand not just what they ordered, but what they actually needed. Mrs. Henderson wanted elegant canapes for her book club, but what she really needed was to feel sophisticated and worldly in front of women who'd always made her feel provincial. So I created fusion appetizers that looked like French haute cuisine but tasted like comfort. And I taught her the proper names so she could impress her friends with her culinary knowledge. Mr. Kovac ordered simple sandwiches for his construction crew, but what he actually needed was to show his hardworking men that he valued them. So I made those sandwiches with the same care I'd put into a wedding feast: house-made bread, premium, meats, vegetables so fresh they still had garden dirt under their fingernails. His crew started looking forward to lunch instead of just tolerating it, and their productivity soared. The Riverside Community Center wanted cheap food for their fundraising, dinners, but what they really needed was to raise enough money to keep their youth programs running. So I donated my labor and charged only for ingredients, then created a menu so spectacular that people came back year after year, bringing friends, building community around shared meals. Those dinners became legendary, raising enough money to not just maintain programs, but expand them. Within 5 years, Chen's Catering had grown from a desperate immigrant side hustle to Riverside's most sought-after catering company. We'd moved from our apartment kitchen to a commercial space, from just David and me to a staff of 12, from serving church basements to handling the mayor's daughter's wedding reception. But the real milestone came when Pemberton Industries, the largest corporation in the Tri-City area, hired us for their annual shareholder meeting. 500 guests, including board members who flew in from New York and Los Angeles, media coverage, and a client who'd made it clear that failure wasn't an option. "Mrs. Chen," Harold Pemberton himself had said during our planning meeting, "I'm going to be frank with you. We chose your company because your prices were competitive and your references were impeccable. But this event will be attended by some of the most influential people in the business world. If anything goes wrong, if the service is slow, if the food is subpar, if there's even a hint of the amateurish, it won't just be bad for us. It will be the end of your company's reputation in this market." I'd looked at this man who thought he could intimidate me, this wealthy white executive who'd probably never had to build anything from nothing, who'd inherited his position and connections and assumed that gave him the right to threaten a small business owner. And I'd smiled. "Mr. Pemberton," I'd said, "by the end of this event, you'll understand why Chen's Catering doesn't just meet expectations. We exceed them in ways you didn't know were possible." The Pemberton Industries shareholder meeting became the stuff of local legend. I created a menu that showcased technical precision while maintaining approachability, dishes that impressed food critics but didn't alienate conservative Midwestern palates, seared duck breast with 5-spice reduction that had visiting executives asking for the recipe, vegetarian spring rolls so expertly crafted that dedicated carnivores requested seconds, a dessert course that began with traditional fortune cookies and ended with chocolate souffle infused with jasmine tea. But the real masterstroke was in the service. I'd noticed during our planning meetings that Pemberton Industries was struggling with internal divisions, the old guard resistant to modernization, younger executives frustrated by outdated practices, everyone so focused on corporate politics that they'd forgotten they were supposed to be on the same team. So I designed the service flow to encourage mingling, placed food stations strategically to break up cliques, and created shared plates. That required cooperation. By the end of the evening, board members who'd been feuding for months were collaborating on business solutions, and Harold Pemberton was shaking my hand with genuine respect. "Mrs. Chen," he'd said, "I've attended corporate events around the world, and I've never seen anything like what you accomplished tonight. You didn't just feed us, you brought us together." The contracts that followed that evening transformed Chen's Catering from a local success story to a regional powerhouse. Pemberton Industries became a regular client, recommending us to their partners and competitors. Within 2 years, we had exclusive arrangements with the city's 3 largest hotels, contracts with the university for all major events, and a waiting list of private clients that stretched 6 months out. By the time Marcus turned 16, Chen's Catering employed 47 people and generated over $2 million in annual revenue. We owned our commercial kitchen outright, had established relationships with suppliers across 3 states, and had built a reputation for excellence that opened doors throughout the Pacific Northwest. But the true measure of our success wasn't in the numbers. It was in the family we'd built along the way. David had left Portland Construction after 5 years to join the business full-time, handling logistics and client relations with the same engineering precision he'd applied to building projects. Marcus had grown up in our commercial kitchen, doing homework at prep tables, learning knife skills alongside our professional cooks, understanding from an early age that success came from hard work and attention to detail. Our staff wasn't just employees, they were extended family. Patricia Winters had started as a part-time server while finishing her business degree and had become my right hand, managing day-to-day operations with the same passion I brought to menu development. Roberto Gonzalez had begun as a prep cook and had evolved into our head chef, adding his own innovative touches to my traditional foundations. Maria Santos handled event coordination with organizational skills that would have impressed Fortune 500 executives. We celebrated their children's birthdays, attended their weddings, helped them through divorces and illnesses and financial emergencies. When Roberto's son needed surgery, we covered the medical bills without question. When Patricia wanted to go back to school for her MBA, we adjusted her schedule and helped with tuition. When Maria's husband was laid off, we created a new position for him in our maintenance department. This was how you built a business that lasted, by understanding that your success was inseparable from the success of the people who made it possible, by treating every employee like family and every client like a friend you wanted to impress, by never forgetting that behind every order was a human being with hopes and fears and the desire to feel special, even if just for one evening. The industry recognition followed naturally. Chefs Association awards for innovation and excellence. Small Business Owner of the Year from the Chamber of Commerce. Features in regional magazines that brought clients from as far away as Seattle and San Francisco. But the achievement I was most proud of was never written up in any publication. The fact that in 25 years of operation, Chen's Catering never had a single employee quit in anger, never had a client lawsuit, never had a health department violation, and never, ever served a meal that we weren't proud to put our name on. When Marcus graduated from college and started his career as an engineer, he'd grown up understanding that success wasn't just about personal achievement, it was about building something that created value for others, that lifted up your community, that left the world a little better than you'd found it. He'd seen his parents start with nothing and create something meaningful through hard work, integrity, and genuine care for others, or so I'd thought. The decision to sell Chen's Catering hadn't been easy, but it had been right. When David was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, when the doctors gave us their timeline and their statistics, I knew immediately what mattered most. Patricia had been running day-to-day operations for years anyway. She understood the business, loved the staff, and had the vision to take it in new directions I'd never considered. "Are you sure about this, Margaret?" David had asked when I'd told him about my decision to sell. We were sitting in our garden, watching the roses bloom for what we both knew might be his last spring. "I'm sure," I'd said, taking his hand in mine. "I built that business to create a good life for our family. Now I want to spend whatever time we have left actually living that good life together." The sale to Patricia had been structured to benefit everyone. She'd gotten the business at fair market value through a payment plan that worked with her finances. Our employees had kept their jobs with someone they trusted, and our clients had continued receiving the same quality service they'd come to expect. I'd walked away with enough money to ensure David's medical care wouldn't be a financial burden, and to provide security for my eventual widowhood. It had been the right choice then, and it remained the right choice now. But what Marcus had never understood, what he'd apparently forgotten in his rush to judge my financial irresponsibility, was that selling Chen's Catering didn't mean I'd lost my business acumen. It meant I'd deployed it in service of love rather than profit. The skills that had built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing didn't disappear just because I'd chosen to focus on my dying husband instead of expanding market share. The strategic thinking that had outmaneuvered larger competitors didn't evaporate because I'd prioritized family over financial growth. The network of relationships I'd built over decades of excellent service didn't vanish because I'd stepped back from daily operations. They'd simply been dormant, waiting for the right moment to be reactivated. As I sat at my kitchen table, sipping David's coffee and watching the morning light shift across the photos that would soon need to be packed, away I began to make my calls. Because Margaret Chen didn't just accept defeat, she regrouped, reassessed, and returned stronger than before. The first call was to Patricia Winters, now the successful owner of what had been renamed Winters Catering, but still operated on the principles we'd established together. "Margaret," Patricia's voice was warm with genuine pleasure. "How are you holding up? I've been meaning to call. It's been too long since we've had coffee." "I'm well, Patricia, though I find myself in an interesting situation. I wonder if you might have time for lunch today. I have a proposition that might interest you." Patricia had built Winters Catering into an even more successful operation than I'd achieved, expanding into corporate consulting and event planning services that went far beyond food service. She understood better than anyone what I was capable of when properly motivated. The second call was to Roberto Gonzalez, who'd eventually left Winters Catering to open his own restaurant, Romano's, which had become Riverside's most acclaimed dining establishment. Roberto had never forgotten who'd given him his first chance, who'd taught him that cooking was about more than following recipes. "Doña Margaret," Roberto said, using the respectful title he'd called me since his first day in our kitchen, "is everything okay? You sound different." "Everything is about to be very interesting, Roberto. Tell me, how would you feel about collaborating on a new venture? Something that would let us work together again?" The third call was to Maria Santos, who'd leveraged her event coordination experience into a successful wedding planning business. Maria understood logistics, understood people, and most importantly, understood loyalty. "Mrs. Chen, you sound excited about something," Maria observed after we'd exchanged pleasantries. "What are you planning?" "Something that will remind certain people why they should never underestimate family," I replied. "Are you free for dinner tomorrow? I have an opportunity that might appeal to your sense of justice." By noon, I'd made 17 phone calls to people who owed me favors, respected my judgment, or simply understood that when Margaret Chen asked for help, it was usually for something worth doing. Suppliers who'd built their businesses partly on the volume Chen's Catering had provided. Former employees who'd gone on to successful careers in hospitality and food service. Clients who'd become friends over years of excellent service. The responses were uniformly enthusiastic. Not because people were afraid to say no, but because they remembered what it felt like to be part of something excellent, something meaningful, something that created value for everyone involved. That evening, as I began the process of carefully packing the belongings I'd accumulated over 35 years in this house, I wasn't thinking about where I'd go or how I'd manage on a fixed income. I was thinking about the lesson Marcus was about to learn, that the broke old lady he'd dismissed so casually had more resources than money, more power than property, and more determination than he'd inherited despite sharing my DNA. Because here's what my ungrateful son had never bothered to learn about his mother. I didn't build Chen's Catering through luck or accident. I built it through strategic thinking, meticulous planning, and an absolute refusal to accept that anyone else's limitations needed to become my own. I'd started with nothing and created something extraordinary through intelligence, hard work, and the ability to inspire excellence in others. And if I could do it once, I could certainly do it again. Marcus thought he'd solved his financial problems by evicting his mother. What he'd actually done was provide me with the perfect motivation to show him exactly what he'd thrown away. By the time I was finished, he'd understand that respect isn't something you can demand. It's something you earn. And he'd learn that family isn't a burden to be optimized away. It's a treasure that, once lost, can never truly be recovered. The game was indeed about to begin, and this time, I wasn't playing for profit or recognition or market share. I was playing for justice. And Margaret Chen had never lost a game that truly mattered. To understand the full depth of Marcus's betrayal, You need to see what our family was like before Sarah's influence transformed my generous, grateful son into a calculating stranger, who could look his mother in the eye and demand rent for the home where she'd raised him. You need to understand the foundation of love, sacrifice, and shared values that had been built over decades, and how completely it had been demolished in just 5 short years. The Marcus Thorne raised wasn't born cruel, greed wasn't in his DNA, and selfishness wasn't part of his character. The boy who grew up in this house had been kind, thoughtful, and deeply grateful for the opportunities his parents provided. He'd understood that success was something you shared, not something you hoarded. He'd known that family meant putting each other first, especially when times were tough. But let me take you back to who we really were. Before ambition poisoned love and before my son learned to see his mother as a financial liability rather than the woman who'd given him everything. Some of my most treasured memories of Marcus centered around our kitchen, the same kitchen where he'd just served me eviction papers, but which had once been the heart of our family's happiness. When Marcus was 8 years old, he'd started what he called helping with the catering business, though his help usually created more work than it solved. Every Saturday morning, he'd wake up at dawn to assist with prep work for Sunday events, standing on a wooden step stool David had built so he could reach the prep tables. "Mom, can I crack the eggs today?" he'd ask, his small face serious with concentration as he attempted to separate yolks without breaking them. "I've been practicing, and I think I'm getting better." He was terrible at it, of course. 8-year-old hands aren't steady enough for delicate work, and we'd inevitably end up with eggshells in our mise en place and yolk mixed with whites that needed to be pristine. But I never said no, because watching Marcus's pride when he successfully separated even one egg was worth the extra time it took to fix his mistakes. "Perfect," I'd tell him as he beamed with accomplishment. "But next time, try cracking it on the flat surface instead of the edge of the bowl. It gives you more control." "Like this?" he'd ask, adjusting his technique with the focused attention he brought to everything he cared about. Exactly like that. "You're going to be a better cook than your mother someday." "No way!" Marcus would protest, looking at me with the uncomplicated adoration that only young children can manage. "Nobody's a better cook than you, Mom. You're magic in the kitchen." Magic. That's how he'd seen me then, as someone who could transform simple ingredients into celebrations, who could make any occasion special through the alchemy of food and love. He'd believed his mother was capable of anything, and more importantly, he'd wanted to be part of that magic. Those Saturday morning prep sessions weren't just about food, they were about building the values that would guide his life. While we worked, I'd tell him stories about my own childhood, about learning to cook from my grandmother in Hong Kong, about the importance of treating every ingredient with respect and every meal as an opportunity to show love. In Chinese culture, I'd explain as we measured spices for our signature 5-spice blend, food is how we express care for each other. When someone cooks for you, they're not just feeding your body, they're nourishing your soul. That's why we never serve anything we wouldn't want to eat ourselves. Marcus absorbed these lessons with the seriousness of a much older child. "So, when you cook for other people, you're showing them they matter?" Exactly. And when they trust us with their important moments, their weddings, their celebrations, their family gatherings, we have a responsibility to make those moments as perfect as possible. Because their happiness depends on us doing our best work? Because their happiness matters as much as our own, I'd correct gently. Success isn't just about doing well for yourself, sweetheart. It's about lifting others up, making their lives better, contributing something positive to the world. These weren't just pretty words to Marcus. They became the foundation of how he approached everything. When he played Little League Baseball, he was the kid who stayed after practice to help younger players improve their swings. When his classmates struggled with math, he'd spend his recess time tutoring them instead of playing. When our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Kim, fell and broke her hip, 10-year-old Marcus organized the neighborhood children to help with her yard work. "Mom," he'd announced after spending his Saturday raking Mrs. Kim's leaves, She tried to pay me, but I told her neighbors help neighbors. That's what families do, right? And neighbors are like family too. Where did you learn that? I'd asked, though I already knew the answer. From watching you and Dad, he'd said simply. You help people even when they can't pay you back. Like when you catered Mrs. Patterson's daughter's wedding for free because they couldn't afford it. Like when Dad fixed Mr. Rodriguez's porch without charging him. That's what good people do. That was my son at 10 years old. Already understanding that true wealth came from what you gave to others, not what you accumulated for yourself. Already living the values David and I had tried to model every day of his life. The teenage years brought their own challenges, as they do for every family. But Marcus never lost his fundamental decency. When he got his first job at 16, working, weekends at Romano's restaurant, washing dishes and learning the food service industry from the ground up, he didn't see it as beneath him or temporary. He saw it as education. Roberto says, if I want to understand the restaurant business, I need to start at the bottom and learn every position, Marcus explained when he came home exhausted after his first double shift. He says you can't lead people if you don't understand what their jobs actually require. Roberto's right. David had agreed. Your mother built Chen's Catering by working every position herself first. She can cook, serve, plan events, manage inventory, handle clients, and balance books because she learned each piece of the business. I want to be like Mom, Marcus had said, and the simple sincerity of the statement had made my eyes fill with tears. I want to build something that helps people and makes them happy. Throughout high school, Marcus worked at Romano's every weekend and school holiday, gradually moving from dishwasher to prep cook to line cook. He'd come home smelling like kitchen grease and industrial detergent, his hands stained with vegetable dyes and cut with tiny nicks from learning knife skills. But his eyes would be bright with excitement as he told us about new techniques he'd learned or compliments he'd received from customers. Mrs. Henderson came in tonight, he'd report, and she specifically asked Roberto to thank whoever made her salmon. She said it was the best she'd ever had outside of fine dining restaurants. Roberto told her it was me, and she asked for my name so she could request me again next time. The pride in his voice wasn't about ego. It was about the satisfaction of excellence, the joy of knowing he'd contributed to someone else's happiness. This was the son I'd raised, the boy who understood that work wasn't just about earning money, but about earning respect through quality and dedication. College brought new challenges and new opportunities for Marcus to demonstrate the character David and I had tried to instill. He'd chosen engineering partly because he loved the problem-solving aspects, but mostly because he wanted to build things that would last, that would serve communities, that would make life better for ordinary people. I don't want to design mansions for rich people, he'd told us during his sophomore year, home for winter break and full of ideas about his future. I want to work on affordable housing, community centers, schools, places where regular families spend their lives, buildings that serve people who actually need them. His senior project had been designing a community center for underserved neighborhoods, incorporating accessibility features, sustainable materials, and flexible spaces that could serve multiple functions. The design was elegant but not flashy, efficient but not sterile, beautiful but not pretentious. It was architecture that prioritized users over architects, function over form, community over individual expression. This is beautiful work, David had said, studying the detailed drawings Marcus had spread across our dining room table. Tell me about these accessibility features. Everyone deserves to feel welcome and able to participate, Marcus had explained, pointing to the ramps that were integrated so seamlessly they looked like design elements rather than accommodations. I spent time at the Disability Resource Center, talking to people about what actually works and what just looks good on paper. A lot of accessible buildings are technically compliant but practically difficult to use. And the materials? I'd asked, noting the specifications for locally sourced, environmentally sustainable components. I want to prove that responsible building doesn't have to cost more if you're smart about design and sourcing. These materials will last longer, require less maintenance, and support local suppliers. It's better for the community and better for the budget. This was my son at 22, already thinking systemically, already considering the impact of his choices on others, already committed to using his talents in service of something larger than himself. The values we'd taught him in our kitchen had evolved into a professional philosophy that would have made us proud to see him implement. After graduation, Marcus had multiple job offers from prestigious firms, including some that would have started him at salaries higher than David and I had ever imagined possible. But he'd chosen Riverside Engineering specifically because they specialized in public projects and community development rather than luxury commercial work. The money's not as good as some of the other offers, he'd acknowledged, but the work is more meaningful. I'll be designing schools, libraries, community centers, places that actually matter to people's daily lives. Money isn't everything, David had reminded him. Job satisfaction and meaningful work are worth more than a bigger paycheck. I learned that from watching you two, Marcus had replied. You could have expanded Chen's catering much faster if you'd been willing to compromise on quality or cut corners on staff benefits. But you built something sustainable instead of something quick. I want to do the same thing. The early years of Marcus's career had been everything we'd hoped for him. He'd thrown himself into his work with enthusiasm and integrity, quickly earning respect from colleagues and clients alike. His projects weren't the biggest or most glamorous, but they were thoughtful, well executed, and genuinely beneficial to the communities they served. When the old Riverside Community Center needed structural upgrades, Marcus had volunteered to do the assessment work pro bono, spending his weekends crawling through basements and climbing into rafters to ensure the building was safe for the hundreds of children and families who used it daily. They can't afford to hire an engineering firm, he'd explained when I'd asked why he was working for free, but they can't afford not to know if the building is safe either. Some things are more important than billing hours. When the local elementary school needed playground equipment that met new safety standards, Marcus had researched manufacturers, negotiated bulk pricing, and even helped with installation to keep costs down. The school district had been prepared to eliminate recess equipment entirely due to budget constraints, but Marcus's efforts had not only saved the playground, but improved it significantly. Kids need safe places to play, he'd said simply. If I can help make that happen, then that's what I should do. This was who Marcus had been for the first 35 years of his life. Generous, thoughtful, committed to using his advantages to benefit others. He'd been the kind of man who'd rather work harder for less money if it meant doing work that mattered. He'd been the kind of son who'd rather spend his Saturdays helping his community than pursuing personal hobbies. And he'd been the kind of family member who understood that our success was shared success, that our resources were collective resources, that taking care of each other was not just an obligation, but a privilege. When David first started showing symptoms of what would eventually be diagnosed as pancreatic cancer, Marcus had immediately stepped up to help in ways that went far beyond what we'd ever asked or expected. He'd rearranged his work schedule to drive David to medical appointments, had researched treatment options and specialists, had made himself available for whatever support we needed. Dad, you don't have to pretend you're fine, Marcus had said during one of David's early attempts to downplay his symptoms. We're family. We face difficult things together. When the diagnosis became official and the prognosis became clear, Marcus had taken family medical leave to help us navigate David's final months. He'd coordinated with doctors, managed medications, helped with physical therapy exercises, and most importantly, had simply been present for the conversations and quiet moments that meant everything to a man facing the end of his life. I want to make sure Dad knows how much he means to me, Marcus had told me during one of the many evenings we'd spent sitting by David's bedside, watching old movies and sharing memories. I want him to know that everything good about my life came from what you two taught me. David's death had been peaceful, surrounded by love, with Marcus holding one hand and me holding the other. In his final moments, David had looked at our son and whispered, "Take care of your mother. She's the strongest person I know, but she shouldn't have to be strong alone." "I promise, Dad," Marcus had replied, tears streaming down his face. "I'll always take care of her." Those words, "I'll always take care of her," had been spoken with such sincerity, such commitment, that I'd believed them completely. Marcus had meant them completely, in that moment of grief and love and desperate desire to honor his father's final request. The months following David's death had indeed demonstrated Marcus's commitment to his promise. He'd helped me sort through David's belongings, had handled the complex paperwork of widowhood, had made sure I wasn't navigating grief and logistics alone. He'd established our Tuesday morning breakfast tradition, had checked on me regularly, had included me in his plans and decisions. When I'd made the difficult choice to sell Chen's Catering, Marcus had supported the decision wholeheartedly. "Dad, would be proud of you for choosing family over business," he'd said. "You're doing exactly what he would have wanted." When I'd struggled with the empty house and the silence of widowhood, Marcus had helped me establish new routines, had encouraged me to maintain connections with friends and former colleagues, had made sure I felt valued and needed even in retirement. "You raised me to understand that family comes first," he'd reminded me during one of our conversations about my adjustment to widowhood. "Now it's my turn to put family first. You took care of me for 30 years. I'm going to take care of you for the next 30. For the first year and a half after David's death, Marcus had been the son we'd raised. Attentive, grateful, committed to family values over personal convenience. He'd visit twice a week, had called every few days, had included me in holiday plans and social events. I'd felt secure in the knowledge that while I'd lost my husband, I still had my son's love and support. The change had been gradual at first, so subtle that I'd attributed it to natural adjustments as Marcus moved forward with his life. When he'd started dating Sarah, I'd been happy for him. He deserved love and companionship, and I'd encouraged him to invest in building a future with someone who made him happy. "She's lovely," I'd told him after meeting Sarah for the first time. "She seems very focused." "She is focused," Marcus had agreed, though something in his tone had suggested he was still figuring out whether that was entirely positive. "She knows what she wants out of life." What Sarah had wanted, I'd learned gradually, was a very different life than the one Marcus had been building. She'd grown up in a family where success was measured primarily by financial accumulation and social status. Her parents were wealthy but cold, accomplished but disconnected, impressive on paper but lacking the warmth and genuine connection that had characterized. Sarah had looked at Marcus's commitment to community work and pro bono projects as charming but impractical. She'd seen his close relationship with his widowed mother as sweet but limiting. She'd viewed his satisfaction with meaningful work over maximum income as admirable but naive, and slowly, systematically, she'd begun reshaping his priorities to align with her own. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a careful process of suggestion, comparison, and gradual isolation. Sarah had never directly criticized Marcus's values or our family's way of life. Instead, she'd introduced alternatives that seemed more sophisticated, more successful, more worthy of his talents. Instead of spending Saturday mornings helping me with household projects, Marcus had started attending networking events, where he could meet influential people in the industry. Instead of volunteering his time for community projects, he'd begun taking on higher-paying private clients to build his portfolio. Instead of our relaxed family dinners, he'd started attending business functions where important connections could be made. Each change had been presented as an addition rather than a replacement, an expansion rather than an abandonment. But gradually, the additions had crowded out the foundations, and the expansion had actually been a contraction of everything that had made Marcus the man we'd been proud to raise. The saddest part wasn't that Marcus had changed. People grow, and evolve, and I'd never expected him to remain exactly the same person forever. The saddest part was that in gaining Sarah's version of success, he'd lost sight of his own sense of purpose and satisfaction. The work that had once energized him had become just a job. The relationships that had once sustained him had become networking opportunities. The family that had once been his foundation had become a burden to be managed. By the time Sarah had moved in with Marcus, then married him, then begun pressuring him to optimize his financial situation, the transformation was complete. The grateful son who'd promised to always take care of his mother had become a calculating stranger who could serve eviction papers over breakfast without apparent conscience. But as I sat in my kitchen that Tuesday morning, surrounded by the remnants of a life that was about to be packed away, I reminded myself that people don't really change at their core. They just get buried under layers of other people's expectations and ambitions. The Marcus I'd raised was still in there somewhere, underneath Sarah's influence and society's pressure and his own confusion about what constituted a life worth living. Maybe what I was about to do would help him remember who he'd been before. He'd forgotten who he was supposed to become. Maybe the shock of losing what he'd taken for granted would remind him of why gratitude mattered, why family was precious, why success without soul was just another form of failure. Or maybe it wouldn't. Maybe the son I'd raised was truly gone, replaced permanently by this stranger who saw his mother as a financial liability rather than the woman who'd given him everything. Either way, Marcus was about to learn that the foundation he'd abandoned had been stronger than he'd realized, and that the woman he'd dismissed as weak and dependent had more resources, more resolve, and more strategic thinking than he'd ever imagined. The game was about to begin, and this time, I wasn't playing to build something beautiful. I was playing to tear down something ugly and see if anything worth saving remained underneath. Sarah Whitman entered our lives on a crisp October evening in 2018, 5 months after David's death, when I was still navigating the strange terrain of widowhood, and Marcus was trying to balance his grief with his determination to honor his father's final request to take care of me. She arrived at our front door carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than our weekly grocery budget, and wearing a smile that was perfectly calibrated to charm without seeming calculated. "You must be Margaret," she said, extending a manicured hand that had clearly never washed dishes or kneaded bread. "Marcus has told me so much about you. I've been looking forward to meeting the woman who raised such an exceptional man." The words were exactly right, respectful, complimentary, acknowledging both my role in Marcus's life and his value as a person. But something in her delivery felt rehearsed, as if she'd practiced this introduction in front of a mirror until it sounded natural. Still, I was lonely in those early months of widowhood, grateful for any expansion of our small family circle, and determined to welcome anyone who made my son happy. "Please come in," I said, accepting the wine and noting its impressive label. "Marcus didn't tell me you had such excellent taste." "Oh, this old thing." Sarah laughed, the sound bright and practiced. "My father always says life's too short for cheap wine. I thought we should celebrate properly. It's not every day I get to meet my boyfriend's mother." Boyfriend, not partner, not significant other, but the old-fashioned term that suggested serious intentions while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Another perfectly calculated choice. Marcus appeared from the kitchen, where he'd been helping me prepare dinner. A simple meal of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans that represented comfort food rather than sophistication. He looked nervous, eager for our approval of each other, completely unaware that Sarah was already conducting a careful assessment of everything she saw. "Mom, you remember I told you about Sarah? She's the marketing director at Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals." Marketing director. At 28, Sarah held a position that commanded respect and presumably significant income. She was clearly intelligent, accomplished, ambitious, all qualities I normally admired. But as she surveyed our modest dining room with its family, photos, and handmade decorations, I caught a flash of something that might have been disappointment or calculation, quickly masked by polite interest. "What a lovely home," she said, and again the words were perfect while the delivery felt slightly off. "So warm and lived in. You can really feel the history here. History." An interesting word choice. Not love or family or memories, but history. Something that belonged to the past rather than the present. Dinner conversation revealed Sarah to be intelligent, well-informed, and strategically charming. She asked thoughtful questions about my catering business, expressed appropriate sympathy about David's death, and showed genuine interest in Marcus's work. But I found myself studying her responses, noting how carefully she modulated her reactions to present herself in the most favorable light possible. When I mentioned the community center project Marcus had completed pro bono, Sarah's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly before she said, "How wonderful that you can afford to donate your expertise like that. It must be nice to have the financial security to choose projects based on passion rather than necessity." The comment was ostensibly positive, but it contained a subtle dig, the suggestion that pro bono work was a luxury rather than a responsibility, something only people with excess resources could afford to indulge in. When Marcus talked about his plans to expand his community development work, Sarah nodded enthusiastically while asking pointed questions about growth potential, profit margins, and scalability. "Have you considered how to systematize your approach so you could handle larger projects? There's probably significant money in developing a consulting model around community development." Again, the response seemed supportive while fundamentally missing the point. Marcus wasn't interested in systematizing community service. He was interested in serving communities. The work wasn't supposed to be scalable. It was supposed to be personal, responsive to specific needs rather than optimized for maximum efficiency. But Marcus, eager to impress and perhaps influenced by Sarah's business acumen, began explaining how his methods could indeed be applied more broadly. I watched him unconsciously adopt her language, talking about scaling impact and sustainable models instead of simply helping people who needed help. After dinner, as we moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, Sarah's attention was drawn to our family photo collection. She studied each picture with what appeared to be genuine interest, asking about family history, commenting on how Marcus had grown and changed over the years. "You were such a serious little boy," she observed, looking at a photo of 8-year-old Marcus in his Little League uniform. "Even then, you looked like you were thinking deep thoughts." He was always thoughtful, I agreed. Even as a small child, Marcus cared deeply about fairness, about making sure everyone was included and treated. "Well, that's so sweet," Sarah said, but I noticed she'd moved on to a more recent photo. Marcus at his college graduation, looking confident and accomplished in his cap and gown. "This is more how I picture you. Successful, professional, ready to take on the world." The comment seemed innocent enough, but it subtly divided Marcus's life into sweet childhood and serious adulthood, suggesting that caring about fairness and inclusion were childish qualities to be outgrown rather than adult virtues to be preserved. As the evening progressed, I found myself both impressed and unsettled by Sarah. She was undeniably intelligent, articulate, and professionally successful. She clearly cared about Marcus, or at least about securing a relationship with him. She was polite to me, respectful of our home, and appropriately appreciative of the meal I'd prepared. But there was something calculated about her charm, something strategic about her questions, something evaluative about the way she observed our family dynamics. She wasn't just getting to know us, she was assessing us, determining how we fit into whatever vision she had for her future with Marcus. When they prepared to leave, Sarah helped clear dishes and complimented the meal with specific details that showed she'd been paying attention. The chicken was perfectly seasoned, and that stuffing recipe is definitely something I'd love to learn. Marcus is so lucky to have grown up with home cooking like this. I'd be happy to teach you, I offered, hoping to build a connection with this woman who was clearly important to my son. That's so generous, Sarah replied. Though with my schedule, I'm afraid I'm more of a takeout person these days. Maybe once things settle down at work. It was a polite deflection, declining my offer while making it seem like a scheduling issue rather than a lack of interest. But the subtext was clear. She wasn't planning to learn my recipes because she wasn't planning to cook family meals. That wasn't part of her vision for her life with Marcus. After they left, I sat in my kitchen washing dishes and trying to process my mixed feelings about Sarah. Marcus was clearly smitten. He'd watched her all evening with the kind of attention that suggested he was still in the honeymoon phase of infatuation. She was beautiful, successful, and sophisticated in ways that I could understand would appeal to a man ready to build his adult life. But something about her presence had made me feel diminished, as if my simple life and modest accomplishments were being measured against different standards and found wanting. It wasn't anything she'd said directly. Her words had been consistently appropriate and kind. It was more about what she'd chosen to focus on, what she'd valued, what she'd seemed to see as worth preserving, versus what she'd apparently dismissed as irrelevant. Over the following weeks, Sarah became a regular presence in Marcus's life, and by extension, in mine. She joined us for Sunday dinners, accompanied Marcus to family events, and gradually established herself as a permanent fixture in our household routines. On the surface, her integration appeared seamless. She was always polite, always appropriately, dressed, always armed with hostess gifts and compliments. But I began noticing subtle changes in Marcus during this period, small shifts in his language and priorities that seemed to align with Sarah's worldview rather than the values David and I had taught him. When I mentioned a news story about a local family losing their home to foreclosure, Marcus's first response used to be concern for their welfare and speculation about how the community might help. Now his initial reaction was analysis of the housing market conditions that had led to their situation, and discussion of the investment opportunities such circumstances might create. When our neighbor Mrs. Patterson asked Marcus to help with a i.e. small repair project, he used to simply show up with his tools and take care of the problem. Now he talked about time management and opportunity costs, eventually helping but with a kind of grudging efficiency that suggested he saw the favor as an interruption to more important activities. When local nonprofits reached out for volunteer assistance, Marcus began declining requests that he'd previously accepted automatically. I need to be more strategic about my time, he'd explain. Sarah's helping me understand that saying yes to everything means I can't excel at anything. The language was Sarah's. Strategic, optimization, excellence measured in terms of individual achievement rather than community contribution. But Marcus adopted it as if these insights represented sophisticated thinking rather than a fundamental reorientation of his values. Sarah's influence became more apparent during the holiday season. Marcus had always loved our family Christmas traditions, the elaborate meal we prepared together, the evening of caroling in our neighborhood, the practice of choosing gifts that reflected deep knowledge of the recipient rather than impressive price tags. These traditions weren't sophisticated or Instagram-worthy, but they were ours, saturated with decades of shared history and love. You know, Sarah mentioned casually during our December meal planning conversation, Marcus and I were invited to the mayor's Christmas gala this year. It's a really significant networking opportunity. All the city's major business leaders will be there. The gala was scheduled for December 23rd, the same evening we'd planned our traditional Christmas Eve preparation, cooking together, wrapping final gifts, attending midnight services at our family church. It was the most sacred evening of our holiday calendar, the culmination of weeks of anticipation and preparation. That sounds wonderful, I said carefully. What time does it start? Maybe you could stop by here first, or join us afterward. Sarah's smile was sympathetic but firm. Unfortunately, these events run quite late, And there are usually after-parties with the most important connections. We'd probably need to make it our primary Christmas commitment. Primary Christmas commitment. Not celebration, not tradition, not family time, but commitment. Language that made our family gathering sound optional rather than fundamental. Marcus looked torn, glancing between Sarah and me with visible discomfort. Maybe we could do both somehow. Stop by the gala for an hour? Then come back for our traditions. Darling, Sarah said, and the endearment carried a subtle note of correction. You can't really network effectively if people know you're planning to leave early. It sends the wrong message about your priorities. Priorities. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Was family a priority? Or was it an obstacle to more important priorities? Mom would understand, Marcus said, looking at me with appeal in his eyes. Wouldn't you, Mom? This could be really important for my career. What could I say? That I didn't understand? That his career shouldn't matter more than Christmas Eve with his widowed mother? That Sarah was asking him to choose between his future and his past, and I was afraid of which choice he'd make? Of course I understand, I said, because that's what mothers do. We make it easy for our children to break our hearts if that's what they think they need to do. Career opportunities are important, but even as I said the words, I felt something crack inside me. Not break entirely, not yet, but develop the kind of hairline fracture that would eventually split wide open under the right pressure. Marcus attended the mayor's gala, leaving me to spend Christmas Eve alone for the first time. In 38 years. He called twice. Once to check if I was okay, once to share excitement about meeting several prominent business leaders who'd expressed interest in his work. His voice was animated in a way I hadn't heard since before David's death, and I tried to feel happy that he was happy, even if his happiness seemed to require my loneliness. Sarah's transformation of Marcus accelerated after the holidays. She began involving him in her social circle, young professionals who measured success by income and possessions, who talked about careers as if they were competitive sports, who seemed to view personal relationships as strategic alliances rather than sources of meaning and support. You should meet Sarah's friends, Marcus told me after one of their gatherings. They're all so accomplished, so focused on building something significant with their lives. It's inspiring to be around people who think big. Thinking big, apparently, meant thinking beyond family obligations and community commitments. It meant prioritizing individual advancement over collective welfare. It meant measuring worth by accumulation rather than contribution. The changes in Marcus weren't dramatic enough to constitute obvious betrayal. They were more like gradual erosion, the way water slowly wears away stone, until what once seemed solid becomes fragile. Each individual change seemed reasonable, even positive. Who could argue with networking, professional development, strategic thinking, ambitious goal setting? But, collectively, these changes were transforming my son from someone who found purpose in helping others into someone who found purpose in helping himself. From someone who saw success as something to be shared into someone who saw it as something to be accumulated. From someone who valued relationships for their own sake into someone who valued them for their utility. By the spring of 2019, Marcus had started talking about upgrading various aspects of his life, his apartment, his car, his wardrobe, his professional associations. The language of upgrade suggested that his previous choices had been inferior rather than simply different, that growth required abandonment rather than expansion. Sarah's been helping me think about my professional image, he explained when he showed up to Sunday dinner wearing an expensive suit instead of his usual casual clothes. She says if I want to be taken seriously by high-level clients, I need to look the part. You look very handsome, I said, because he did. But I missed the relaxed comfort of the son who used to roll up his sleeves and help with dishes, who'd valued substance over style, who'd cared more about being good than looking successful. Thanks, Mom. Sarah found this great menswear consultant Who really understands executive presence? It's amazing how much difference the right clothes make in how people perceive your capabilities. Executive presence, professional image, strategic networking. Sarah's vocabulary was becoming Marcus's vocabulary, and with it, her values were becoming his values. The son who'd once proudly worn jeans and work boots to community meetings because he'd valued authenticity over appearances was now worried about being taken seriously by people who judged capabilities by clothing rather than character. The most painful part wasn't that Marcus was changing. It was that he seemed to believe these changes represented growth rather than loss. He talked about his old mindset, as if caring about community service and family relationships had been naive rather than admirable. He described his previous choices as limiting rather than meaningful. I used to think small, he told me during one of our increasingly strained Sunday dinners. I was focused on helping individual families or single communities instead of thinking about broader impact. Sarah's helping me understand how to scale my influence. Scale his influence. As if influence were a commodity to be maximized rather than a responsibility to be exercised thoughtfully. As if helping individual families were somehow insufficient compared to whatever broader impact Sarah had convinced him to pursue. What kind of broader impact? I asked, genuinely curious about this new direction Sarah was encouraging. Well, instead of doing pro bono work for individual nonprofits, I could develop consulting services for multiple organizations. Instead of volunteering time, I could create sustainable revenue streams that would allow me to hire staff and serve more clients simultaneously. It sounded reasonable, even admirable, in the abstract. But I recognized the fundamental shift in motivation. The old Marcus had helped individual families because he'd cared about those specific families. The new Marcus wanted to help more families because it would prove his capabilities and expand his influence. The difference was subtle but crucial. One approach was motivated by love. The other was motivated by ambition. One measured success by the depth of relationships formed. The other measured it by the breadth of impact achieved. Sarah's masterwork in transforming Marcus came in the summer of 2019, when she convinced him to refinance our family home, the house where he'd been raised, where David had died, where I'd planned to live out my remaining years surrounded by memories and familiar comforts. It's just smart financial planning. Marcus had explained when he'd brought me the paperwork. The house has appreciated significantly and current interest rates are historically low. By refinancing and putting the deed in my name, we can avoid potential estate tax complications and ensure everything stays in the family. Estate tax complications. On a modest house that wouldn't have triggered estate taxes under any reasonable scenario. But Sarah had convinced Marcus that this was sophisticated financial planning, rather than what it actually was. A transfer of power that would make me dependent on my son's goodwill for the roof over my head. Sarah's father is an estate planning attorney, Marcus had continued, and he's reviewed all the documents to make sure everything is legally sound. You'll still live here as long as you want, but this protects us from bureaucratic hassles if something happens. Something happens. He couldn't bring himself to say, if you die, but that's what he meant. Sarah had convinced him to treat my eventual death as a logistical problem to be optimized rather than a loss to be grieved. I'd signed the papers because I'd trusted my son, because I'd believed him when he'd promised that nothing would change except the legal technicalities. Because I'd still believed, despite mounting evidence to the contrary, that the values David and I had instilled in Marcus were stronger than Sarah's influence. That trust had been naive, perhaps, but it hadn't been unreasonable. The Marcus I'd raised would never have used a deed transfer to manipulate his mother. The Marcus I'd raised would have seen our family home as a sacred trust rather than a financial asset to be optimized. But Sarah had systematically dismantled that Marcus, replacing his gratitude with ambition, his generosity with calculation, his family loyalty with professional networking. She'd convinced him that his parents' values were limitations to be overcome, rather than strengths to be preserved. By the time Sarah and Marcus announced their engagement in December 2019, the transformation was complete. The son who'd promised to always take care of his mother had become a stranger who saw his mother as an obstacle to the life his fiancé had planned for them. The engagement party was held at the country club Sarah's family belonged to, an elegant affair with expensive catering, premium alcohol, and a guest list that included all of Sarah's professional contacts and none of Marcus's old friends from his community work. I was invited, of course, but I felt like a charity case at my own son's celebration, wearing my best dress to an event where everyone else's casual outfits probably cost more than my monthly budget. "Isn't this wonderful?" Sarah had gushed, showing off her engagement ring to a group of her pharmaceutical industry colleagues. Marcus is such an ambitious man. He's going to transform the engineering industry with his innovative approaches to community development. Transform the industry. Innovative approaches. The language made Marcus's work sound like corporate strategy rather than public service, like market disruption rather than community care. As I watched my son work the room with Sarah, introducing himself as Marcus Whitman Chen, apparently hyphenating their names to appeal to Sarah's feminist sensibilities while maintaining his professional brand, I realized that the catalyst had achieved her goal. She'd successfully transformed a generous, community-minded engineer into an ambitious, strategically thinking professional who saw opportunities where he'd once seen responsibilities. The Marcus I'd raised was gone, replaced by someone who looked like my son but thought like Sarah's project. And the most heartbreaking part was that Marcus seemed genuinely happy with this transformation, convinced that he'd evolved rather than devolved, grown rather than shrunk, improved rather than lost himself. Standing in that country club ballroom, surrounded by strangers celebrating my son's engagement to a woman who'd systematically erased everything I'd taught him to value, I finally understood what David had meant when he'd asked Marcus to take care of me. He hadn't been asking for financial support or practical assistance. He'd been asking Marcus to preserve the family bonds that had sustained us through decades of joy and sorrow. But Sarah had severed those bonds so skillfully that Marcus didn't even realize they were gone. In her version of success, family was something you managed rather than something you cherished, something you optimized rather than something you served. The catalyst had arrived, and the damage was complete. Now all that remained was to see how long it would take for Marcus to realize what he'd lost in his rush to gain what Sarah had convinced him he wanted. As it turned out, he was about to find out much sooner than he'd expected. The final chapter of Marcus's transformation began with Sarah's pregnancy announcement in March 2021, 2 years into their marriage. What should have been a joyful expansion of our family became instead the catalyst for Sarah's most ruthless assault on the bonds that still connected my son to his origins, his values, and his mother. "We're expecting," Marcus had announced during one of our increasingly infrequent Tuesday breakfasts, his face glowing with the kind of happiness I hadn't seen since before David's death. For a brief, shining moment, I saw my real son again. The boy who'd always loved children, who'd talked about being a father since he was barely more than a child himself. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, tears springing to my eyes as I reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "Your father would be so proud. He always said you'd make a wonderful father." Marcus's smile faltered slightly at the mention of David, the way it always did when reminded of promises he'd made and values he'd abandoned. But Sarah, who'd been watching our interaction with her usual calculating attention, smoothly redirected the conversation toward more practical matters. "We're so excited," she said, placing a protective hand over her still flat belly. "But it's going to require some significant lifestyle adjustments. We've been discussing how to optimize our living situation for a growing family." Optimize. Even pregnancy became a matter of strategic planning in Sarah's vocabulary. Have you thought about names? I asked, hoping to steer the conversation toward the joy of anticipation rather than the logistics of optimization. We have some ideas, Sarah replied vaguely. But our immediate concern is financial planning. Children are expensive, and we need to make sure we're being responsible about our resources. Resources. Not preparing to welcome our child or getting ready to become parents, but managing resources, as if the baby were a business venture rather than a blessing. Over the following weeks, as Sarah's pregnancy progressed, she began making increasingly pointed comments about the financial strain of impending parenthood. During family dinners, she'd mention the cost of childcare, the expense of college savings, the need to maximize household income through efficient asset management. Marcus has been looking into some investment opportunities, she'd mention casually, but it's challenging when so much of our potential capital is tied up in non-productive assets. Non-productive assets. I didn't immediately realize she was referring to me, the widowed mother-in-law living rent-free in a house that could be generating income or sold for investment capital. But as her comments became more frequent and more pointed, the message became unmistakable. I've been researching senior living communities, Sarah announced during a particularly uncomfortable Sunday dinner in June. Some of them are really quite lovely, like cruise ships on land with activities and medical care built right in. It seems like such a pleasant way to spend your golden years. I'm perfectly happy here, I replied firmly. This is my home. Of course, Sarah smiled, but her eyes remained cold. I just think it's important to explore all options, especially now that we need to think about what's best for multiple generations. Multiple generations. As if my presence in my own home were somehow harmful to her unborn child. Marcus, caught between his wife's subtle pressure and his residual loyalty to me, tried to change the subject, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. The way he was beginning to frame our living arrangement as a problem requiring solution rather than a family bond worth preserving. The pressure intensified after their son James was born in November 2021. Sarah used the baby as both shield and weapon, presenting every suggestion as concern for his welfare while making it clear that my continued presence in their house was an obstacle to proper family life. The baby needs his own room, she'd mention, despite the fact that they were using the guest bedroom as a nursery and there were still 2 other unused bedrooms upstairs. And with my mother coming to help, we're really running out of space. Sarah's mother, Linda Whitman, was a piece of work in her own right. A cold, judgmental woman who'd clearly taught her daughter that relationships were transactions and family was a burden to be managed rather than a blessing to be cherished. During her 2-week visit to help with the baby, Linda made her opinion of our living arrangement crystal clear. I don't understand why you're still living here, Margaret, she said with the blunt cruelty that Sarah had learned to disguise behind sweet smiles. Surely a woman your age would be happier in a proper retirement community with people her own age. This is my home, I repeated, though the words were beginning to sound defensive even to my own ears. Was your home? Linda corrected. But times change, don't they? Young families need their space, their independence. It's not fair to burden them with elderly care when there are professionals who specialize in that sort of thing. Elderly care. As if I were an invalid rather than a healthy, independent woman who happened to be in her 70s. But the most devastating aspect of Linda's visit wasn't her direct attacks on me. It was watching how her presence influenced Marcus. Around his mother-in-law, he became even more distant, more formal, more willing to discuss me as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. We've been thinking about Margaret's long-term care needs, I heard him tell Linda during a conversation they didn't realize I could overhear. Sarah's right that we should be proactive about planning rather than waiting for a crisis. Long-term care needs. I was 73 years old, in excellent health, fully capable of managing my own affairs, And my son was discussing me like I was already incapacitated. The sooner you address it, the better, Linda had replied. These situations only get more complicated with time. Better to make the transition while she's still mentally competent. Still mentally competent. As if my mental competence were questionable rather than obvious to anyone who spent 5 minutes in conversation with me. After Linda left, the campaign to relocate me became more aggressive. Sarah began leaving senior living brochures around the house, mentioning wonderful facilities she'd driven past, talking about friends whose parents were so much happier after moving to age-appropriate housing. I toured Sunset Manor yesterday, she announced over dinner one evening, and it's really quite impressive. They have a waiting list, but I mentioned your situation, and they could potentially make an exception. Your situation. My situation. Was being a widow living in the home she'd shared with her husband for 35 years, surrounded by memories and mementos that connected her to a lifetime of love and loss. But in Sarah's framing, my situation was being an elderly burden preventing a young family from achieving their full potential. I didn't ask you to tour anywhere, I said, trying to keep my voice level despite my growing anger. I know, but I thought it would be helpful to have information, Sarah replied with that practiced smile that never reached her eyes. Knowledge is power, right? And the waiting list for quality facilities can be quite long. Knowledge is power. Sarah was always armed with information, statistics, expert opinions that supported whatever conclusion she'd already reached. But her knowledge was selective, focused only on data that reinforced her predetermined agenda, while ignoring anything that contradicted her desired outcome. Marcus, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with these conversations but seemed unable to take a firm stand either way. He'd make weak protests when Sarah's pressure became too obvious, but he'd also nod along when she presented her arguments with sufficient sophistication. Maybe we should at least look at some options, he'd suggest tentatively. Not to make any decisions, but just to understand what's available. Just to understand. But I recognized the slippery slope. Once you begin treating someone's living situation as a problem requiring research and evaluation, you've already accepted the premise that change is necessary. You've moved from, how do we make this work, to how do we make this transition? The birth of their second child, Emma, in August 2023, provided Sarah with the perfect justification for escalating her campaign. Now she had 2 children to protect from the inconvenience of sharing their home with their grandmother, 2 college funds to establish, 2 bedrooms that needed to be converted from unnecessary space into essential family areas. With 2 children, we really need to reconfigure the entire house, Sarah explained, spreading architectural drawings across our dining room table as if she were presenting a business proposal rather than discussing the erasure of my presence from my own home. Emma needs her own room, James is getting older and needs more space, and we're thinking about converting the main floor bedroom into a proper home office for Marcus. The main floor bedroom. My bedroom. The room I'd shared with David for 30 years, where he'd died peacefully in my arms, where I'd grieved and slowly learned to live with loss. Sarah wanted to convert it into office space. Where exactly do you see me fitting into this reconfiguration? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Well, that's what we need to discuss, Sarah said, her tone suggesting this was a reasonable business negotiation rather than a family conversation. We've been thinking that this might be the perfect time for you to explore some of those senior living options we've researched. The kids are at an age where they need stability and routine, and honestly, Margaret, you deserve to be somewhere that's designed for your needs rather than constantly adapting to ours. Your needs versus ours. As if my needs were fundamentally incompatible with family life. As if my presence were an imposition rather than a natural part of multi-generational living. Marcus looked profoundly uncomfortable throughout this presentation, avoiding eye contact and fidgeting with his coffee cup. But he didn't object to Sarah's characterization of the situation, didn't defend my right to remain in my own home, didn't acknowledge that the reconfiguration she was proposing would effectively erase me from the family structure. "Marcus," I said quietly, "what do you think about your wife's plans?" He looked up then, and for a moment I saw something that might have been regret or recognition in his eyes. But Sarah placed her hand over his, a gesture that appeared supportive, but contained an unmistakable message about where his loyalties should lie. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "that we all want what's best for everyone. And maybe it's worth exploring what options exist, not making any decisions," he added, quickly, "but just understanding what's possible. Just understanding what's possible. But possibility, once acknowledged, has a way of becoming probability, then inevitability." By agreeing to explore options, Marcus had already accepted Sarah's premise that my continued presence in our family home was a problem requiring solution. The final phase of Sarah's campaign was conducted with the efficiency of a military operation. She scheduled tours of senior facilities, collected information packets, even arranged for a care assessment to evaluate my needs and capabilities. Every action was presented as helpful research rather than preparation for forced relocation. "The assessment is just to establish a baseline," she explained when I protested. "If we're going to make informed decisions, we need professional input about care requirements and appropriate living situations." Professional input. As if my own assessment of my capabilities were insufficient. As if I couldn't be trusted to understand my own needs and preferences. The care assessor, a pleasant woman named Jennifer who clearly believed she was helping a concerned family make difficult decisions, spent 2 hours evaluating my physical health, cognitive function, and daily living capabilities. Her conclusion was exactly what anyone who knew me could have predicted. I was in excellent health for my age, fully capable of independent living, and showed no signs of cognitive decline or physical impairment. But Sarah managed to spin even this positive assessment into support for her agenda. "See how well you're doing?" she said, reviewing Jennifer's report with apparent delight. "This is exactly why now is the perfect time to make a transition. You're healthy enough to enjoy all the activities and amenities that senior communities offer, rather than waiting until health issues force a more difficult adjustment." The logic was infuriating in its sophistication. Because I was healthy, I should move to a facility designed for people with health problems. Because I was independent, I should relocate to a community that would gradually erode my independence through well-meaning oversight and structured activities. By the winter of 2024, the pressure had become constant and unbearable. Every conversation eventually turned to my living situation. Every family gathering included subtle references to senior communities and their wonderful amenities. Every interaction with Sarah contained the implicit message that my continued presence was preventing her family from achieving their full potential. Marcus, meanwhile, had become a stranger in his own right. The son who'd once promised to always take care of me now spoke about me in the third person even when I was in the room, discussing my situation and needs, as if I were a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. "We've been thinking," he said during one particularly painful conversation, "that maybe it's time to start making some concrete plans. The kids are getting older, Sarah's talking about going back to work part-time, and we need to optimize our living space. For a busy family, optimize our living space." My son was using Sarah's corporate language to justify abandoning his mother, framing cruelty as efficiency and betrayal as smart planning. "What kind of concrete plans?" I asked, though I knew the answer would break my heart. "Well," Marcus said, unable to meet my eyes, "we've been approved for a mortgage modification that would allow us to access some of the house's equity. But the bank requires that there be no other residents with legal claims to the property. No other residents with legal claims." He was talking about me as if I were a squatter, rather than the woman who'd raised him in this house, who'd signed it over to him in trust and love. I don't have any legal claims to the property, I said quietly. You made sure of that when you had me transfer the deed. I know, Marcus said, his discomfort obvious. But there's also the question of fairness to Sarah and the kids. They need stability, and with our current situation. As if my presence in my own home were a temporary aberration rather than the natural order of family life. The final betrayal came on that gray Tuesday morning in October, when Marcus arrived with his lawyer-prepared documents and his ultimatum. But by then, the groundwork had been so thoroughly laid that the actual eviction notice felt almost anticlimactic, the inevitable conclusion to a campaign that had been building for years. What Marcus and Sarah hadn't anticipated, however, was that their systematic assault on my dignity and security had awakened something in me that had been dormant since David's death. Not grief or helplessness, but the strategic thinking and ruthless determination that had built Chen's Catering from nothing into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. They thought they were evicting a broke old lady who would meekly accept whatever crumbs they chose to offer. What they were actually doing was unleashing a woman who'd spent 40 years learning how to identify opportunities in apparent disasters, how to turn other people's underestimation into competitive advantage, and how to build something magnificent from the ashes of what others had tried to destroy. The phone calls I'd made that first day weren't just to old friends and former colleagues. They were to the network I'd built over decades of excellent service, mutual respect, and genuine care for others' success. Patricia Winters, who'd bought my catering business and expanded it into a regional powerhouse. Roberto Gonzalez, whose restaurant had become the most acclaimed dining establishment in 3 counties. Maria Santos, whose event planning company had waiting lists that stretched months into the future. But more than that, I'd called suppliers who'd grown their businesses partly on the volume Chen's Catering had provided. Former employees who'd launched successful careers in hospitality and food service. Clients who'd become friends after years of excellent service for their most important occasions. The response had been immediate and enthusiastic, not because people owed me favors, but because they remembered what it felt like to be part of something excellent, something meaningful, something that created value for everyone involved. Within 72 hours of Marcus's ultimatum, I had the foundation for something Sarah's business school education hadn't prepared her to handle. A strategic response that would turn their short-sighted greed into a lesson they'd never forget. Margaret's Kitchen was born from a simple realization. There was a massive gap in Riverside's food service market between fast casual dining and expensive fine dining. Working families wanted high-quality, freshly prepared meals that were more sophisticated than chain restaurants but more affordable than upscale establishments. They wanted the kind of food that made ordinary Tuesday nights feel special, that turned family dinners into occasions worth savoring. The concept was elegant in its simplicity, a counter-service restaurant offering chef-quality comfort food at family-friendly prices, using locally sourced ingredients and recipes that honored both tradition and innovation. Customers would order at the counter, receive table service, and enjoy food that was prepared with the same care and attention I'd brought to million-dollar catering events. But the real innovation was in the business model. Instead of traditional franchise expansion, Margaret's Kitchen would partner with local entrepreneurs, many of them women over 50 who'd been dismissed by venture capitalists as too old or not scalable, providing them with proven systems, ongoing support, and profit-sharing arrangements that created genuine wealth rather than extractive relationships. Patricia had been the first to commit, offering to invest her resources and reputation in the venture. "I've been waiting 20 years for you to come out of retirement," she'd said. "The food service industry needs someone who remembers that success isn't just about profit margins. It's about creating value for customers, employees, and communities." Roberto had signed on as head of culinary development, bringing his creativity and technical expertise to the challenge of creating restaurant-quality food at fast casual prices. Doña Margaret, he'd said, using the respectful title he'd called me since his first day in our kitchen. This is the project I've been dreaming about. Food that honors both innovation and tradition, that serves working families instead of just impressing food critics. Maria had agreed to handle logistics and site selection, using her event planning expertise to identify locations and negotiate leases. Mrs. Chen, you taught me that success comes from understanding what people really need, not just what they think they want. This concept addresses real needs in our community. Within a week, we had identified our first location. A failed chain restaurant in the heart of Riverside's family neighborhood, across the street from the elementary school Marcus had attended, 2 blocks from the community center where he'd volunteered before Sarah convinced him to prioritize strategic networking over community service. The symbolism wasn't accidental. Margaret's kitchen would serve the families Marcus had abandoned in his pursuit of Sarah's version of success. It would employ people who'd been written off as too old or not worth investing in by venture capitalists who only understood scalable, extractable profit models. It would prove that businesses built on genuine care for customers and employees could compete successfully against corporate chains optimized for maximum shareholder returns. But the most satisfying aspect of the venture was its financing structure. Instead of seeking traditional investors who would demand quarterly profit maximization, we'd structured Margaret's Kitchen as a cooperative owned by its employees, suppliers, and community partners. Everyone who contributed to its success would share in its prosperity, creating sustainable wealth that stayed within the community rather than being extracted by distant shareholders. The initial investment came from an unexpected source, the sale of my personal belongings. The jewelry David had given me over 40 years of marriage, the china we'd received as wedding gifts but rarely used, the artwork we'd collected during our travels, the antique furniture that had been in our family for generations. Each sale felt like losing another piece of my history, but it also felt like investing in my future. Marcus and Sarah had tried to reduce me to nothing, to erase my presence from the home where I'd built my life. But their cruelty had freed me from sentimental attachments that were keeping me anchored to the past instead of building toward the future. The most valuable item was David's vintage Rolex, a gift from his father that had appreciated significantly over the decades. Selling it broke my heart, but it also provided the seed capital for what would become Marcus's most expensive lesson in the difference between price and value. By the time I moved out of the house I'd called home for 35 years, I wasn't fleeing in defeat. I was departing strategically, like a general who withdraws from one battlefield to engage the enemy on terrain of her own choosing. The small apartment I rented was in a converted Victorian mansion 6 blocks from Margaret's Kitchen's future location. It had high ceilings, original hardwood floors, and enough space for the few possessions I'd chosen to keep. More importantly, it had a kitchen where I could experiment with recipes and a dining room where I could host the planning meetings that would define the restaurant's future. Marcus called twice during my moving week, his voice strained with what might have been guilt or concern. "Mom, are you sure you're okay? Sarah feels terrible about how things worked out. Maybe we could help you get settled? Make sure you have everything you need?" Sarah feels terrible. Not, "I feel terrible," or "we made a mistake," but Sarah's emotions were somehow relevant to the conversation. "I'm fine, Marcus," I'd replied, meaning it completely for the first time in years. "I'm exactly where I need to be." "If you need anything," he'd offered weakly, "just call. We want to make sure you're comfortable." Comfortable. As if comfort were the issue rather than respect, dignity, and the fundamental question of how family members treat each other. "I have everything I need," I'd assured him, "but thank you for the offer." What I had was something Marcus couldn't understand and Sarah couldn't control: purpose, community, and the knowledge that came from 40 years of building businesses that served real needs rather than extracting maximum profit from captive markets. Margaret's Kitchen opened 6 months later, on a rainy Tuesday morning that reminded me of the day Marcus had served me eviction papers. But instead of grief and betrayal, this day brought excitement and hope as customers lined up to try the food that had already generated buzz throughout Riverside's tight-knit community. The menu was small but perfectly crafted. 5 entrees that rotated seasonally, 3 sides that could be mixed and matched, 2 soups that changed daily, and desserts that honored both innovation and tradition. Every dish was prepared to order using ingredients sourced from local suppliers who'd committed to sustainable practices and fair wages. But the real magic was in the service model. Customers ordered at the counter, but food was delivered to tables by servers who knew regulars' names and preferences, who asked about family members and remembered important events. The atmosphere was casual but not careless, affordable but not cheap, efficient but not impersonal. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By lunch hour, we had a line out the door. By dinner service, we were turning people away. Local food. Bloggers were posting rave reviews before we'd even officially announced our opening. The mayor stopped by to welcome us to the neighborhood and stayed to eat what she later described as the best comfort food in the county. But the most satisfying moment came 3 days after opening, when Marcus walked through our doors during the lunch rush. He looked around the bustling restaurant with an expression I couldn't quite read, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something familiar yet transformed. "Mom?" he said, approaching the counter where I was expediting orders, with the same efficiency I'd brought to catering events 30 years earlier. Did you do this?" "Welcome to Margaret's Kitchen," I replied with the professional warmth I'd perfected over decades of customer service. "What can we prepare for you today?" He stared at me as if seeing a stranger, which in many ways he was. The broke old lady he'd evicted had been replaced by someone he didn't recognize, a successful entrepreneur surrounded by loyal employees, efficient systems, and satisfied customers. "I don't understand," he said. Where did you get the money for this?" "I sold some things that were taking up space," I replied matter-of-factly. "Sometimes you have to let go of the past to build the future." Marcus looked around the restaurant again, noting the professional kitchen visible through service windows, the sophisticated point-of-sale system, the carefully coordinated service flow that indicated serious business planning rather than amateur enthusiasm. "This looks expensive to set up." "Quality requires investment," I agreed. "But when you understand your market and deliver genuine value, customers are willing to pay for excellence." A line was forming behind Marcus, so I gestured toward the dining area. "Why don't you find a seat? Patricia will take your order and I'll make sure you get something special." Patricia approached Marcus with the professional courtesy she showed all customers, but I saw the slight smile that indicated she recognized him from my descriptions. "Good afternoon. First time joining us?" I'm Margaret's son," Marcus said, as if that gave him some special status. "How wonderful," Patricia replied with apparent warmth. "Your mother talks about you often. She's so proud of everything you've accomplished." I had talked about Marcus often, about the son I'd raised, the values I'd tried to instill, the man he'd been before Sarah's influence had corrupted his character. But I'd also talked about the lessons people learn when they take love for granted, when they mistake kindness for weakness, when they assume that family bonds can be severed without consequences. Marcus ordered the day's special, herb-crusted, salmon with roasted vegetables and wild rice, a dish that demonstrated both technical skill and comfort food sensibilities. While he waited, I watched him observe the restaurant's operations with the analytical eye of someone trying to understand what he was seeing. The lunch crowd was diverse, but clearly local. Construction workers sitting next to retired teachers, young families sharing tables with elderly couples, teenagers from the nearby high school talking with middle-aged professionals. Everyone seemed comfortable, satisfied, genuinely pleased to be there. When Patricia delivered his meal, Marcus took a bite and his expression shifted from confusion to recognition to something that might have been regret. The food was restaurant quality, but approachably priced, sophisticated but not pretentious, exactly the kind of meal that made ordinary moments feel special. "This is incredible," he told Patricia. "I mean, really exceptional." "Your mother trained our entire kitchen staff," Patricia replied proudly. "She has standards that would intimidate most professional chefs, but she also has patience to teach people who want to learn excellence." Standards, patience, teaching excellence. The conversation was becoming pointed without being overtly confrontational, making Marcus aware that his mother's capabilities extended far beyond what he'd assumed or appreciated. After finishing his meal, Marcus approached the counter again. The lunch rush was winding down, giving us a moment for more personal conversation. "Mom, I had no idea you were planning anything like this. When did you? How long have you been working on this?" "I started making calls the day you gave me 30 days' notice," I replied. Sometimes people need motivation to remember what they're capable of. The timing made the point clear. His ultimatum hadn't broken me. It had freed me to pursue opportunities I'd been too comfortable to explore while living in his shadow. "I'm impressed," Marcus said, though his tone suggested he was also confused and perhaps a little intimidated. "This is a real business, not just some hobby project." "Did you think I'd forgotten how to work?" I asked gently. Building Chen's catering took exactly the same skills as building Margaret's kitchen: understanding customers, managing operations, creating value for everyone involved. Marcus was quiet for a moment, perhaps recognizing that he'd drastically underestimated both my capabilities and my resources. Sarah said, "We thought you were struggling financially, that you needed help managing your affairs." Sarah thought what she needed to think to justify what she wanted to do, I replied without rancor. People often mistake kindness for weakness, gratitude for dependency, but successful businesses aren't built by people who need help managing their affairs. The conversation was interrupted by the afternoon rush beginning, but Marcus lingered, watching me coordinate with kitchen staff, manage customer flow, and handle the complex logistics of restaurant operations with the competence that had built my reputation decades earlier. Finally, he gathered his courage to ask the question that was obviously troubling him. "Are you angry with us? With me?" I looked at my son, this stranger who shared my DNA but had forgotten my values, and felt something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't quite forgiveness either. "I'm disappointed," I said honestly. "Not in your success, but in what you were, willing to sacrifice to achieve it. Not in your marriage, but in how you let someone else's priorities replace your own judgment." Marcus looked down at his hands, perhaps remembering the promises he'd made to his dying father, the values he'd once claimed to share, the mother he'd once claimed to love. Sarah says family obligations can become unhealthy dependencies if they're not managed properly, he offered weakly. Sarah says many things, I replied. But here's what I say. Family isn't an obligation to be managed. It's a treasure to be cherished. And when you treat treasures like burdens, you discover too late what you've thrown away. Before Marcus could respond, I was called away to handle a supply delivery, leaving him to sit with the uncomfortable realization that the broke old lady he'd evicted was actually a successful entrepreneur who'd built something meaningful from the ashes of his betrayal. Word of Margaret's kitchen's success spread quickly through Riverside's interconnected community. Local media covered our opening, highlighting the story of the 73-year-old entrepreneur who'd launched a thriving business after being encouraged to downsize by her family. The coverage was respectful but pointed, making clear that my relocation hadn't been entirely voluntary. Social media amplified the story, with customers sharing photos of meals and praising both the food quality and the heartwarming narrative of late-life reinvention. Food bloggers from surrounding cities made special trips to try our menu, invariably leaving with rave reviews and promises to return. But the most meaningful recognition came from within the community we served. Margaret's Kitchen became a gathering place for neighborhood families, a reliable source of excellent meals for busy parents, a training ground for young people learning food service skills, and a symbol of what small businesses could accomplish when they prioritized community value over extractive profit. 3 months after opening, we were generating enough revenue to justify expansion. Instead of franchising or seeking venture capital, we offered partnership opportunities to other women entrepreneurs who understood that sustainable success came from serving community needs rather than maximizing short-term returns. The second, Margaret's Kitchen opened in Millfield, the neighboring town where several of our regular customers lived. The third opened in Brookhaven, expanding our reach while maintaining our commitment to local sourcing and community employment. Each location was owned and operated by local partners who shared our values and our commitment to excellence. The end of our first year, Margaret's Kitchen had become a regional success story, featured in business magazines as an example of how experience and wisdom could create opportunities that venture capitalists and MBA programs often missed. I was invited to speak at entrepreneurship conferences, interviewed by journalists about late-life career transitions, and consulted by other entrepreneurs who wanted to build businesses based on genuine value creation rather than extractive profit maximization. But the most satisfying vindication came from an unexpected source: Marcus's own professional struggles. While I was building a successful restaurant chain, he was discovering that Sarah's ambitious networking strategy had led him into professional relationships that prioritized profit over purpose, efficiency over meaning, individual advancement over community development. The high-paying private clients Sarah had encouraged him to pursue were primarily developers who wanted to maximize square footage while minimizing construction costs, regardless of the impact on surrounding communities, or the people who would eventually occupy their buildings. The strategic networking she'd promoted had connected him with people who saw engineering as a tool for wealth extraction rather than community service. Marcus had become successful in the narrow sense that Sarah valued: higher income, prestigious clients, professional recognition within certain circles. But he'd lost the satisfaction that had once made his work meaningful, the sense of purpose that had sustained him through challenges, the connection to community that had grounded his identity. I learned about his professional dissatisfaction, not from Marcus himself, but from Roberto, who'd maintained connections throughout Riverside's business community. "He looks tired," Roberto observed during one of our planning meetings. "Not physically tired, but spiritually tired. Like someone who's gotten everything he thought he wanted and discovered it wasn't worth what he paid for it." The exhaustion became more apparent during Marcus's increasingly frequent visits to Margaret's Kitchen. He never directly acknowledged what he'd lost by evicting me, but his presence suggested a longing for something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps the sense of belonging and purpose that had characterized our family before Sarah's influence had redirected his priorities. "Business seems to be going well," he'd observe, watching the steady flow of satisfied customers and efficient service that characterized our daily operations. "Business goes well when you understand your customers and care about their experience," I'd reply neutrally, neither dismissing his presence nor welcoming him back into intimacy he'd forfeited through his choices. The final reckoning came on the first anniversary of Margaret's Kitchen's opening, when the local Chamber of Commerce honored me as Entrepreneur of the Year for building a business that demonstrated how commitment to community values could generate both financial success and social impact. The award ceremony was held at the YAR-A Riverside Convention Center, the same venue where Marcus and Sarah had held their engagement party 5 years earlier. But where that event had celebrated their abandonment of family values in pursuit of social advancement, this gathering honored the creation of something that served community needs while respecting the dignity of employees, suppliers, and customers. Marcus and Sarah attended the ceremony, sitting in the back of the room like reluctant witnesses to a transformation they'd never anticipated. I saw them whisper together during my acceptance speech, Sarah's expression suggesting she was trying to minimize the significance of what they were witnessing. But the significance was unmistakable to everyone else in the room. In less than 1 year, the broke old lady they'd evicted had built a business that employed 37 people, sourced ingredients from local suppliers, served hundreds of families weekly, and generated enough profit to fund expansion into neighboring communities. The applause when I finished speaking was sustained and genuine, reflecting not just appreciation for business success, but recognition of the values that had guided that success. I'd proven that enterprises built on genuine care for others could compete successfully against corporate models designed for maximum profit extraction. During the reception that followed, community leaders, customers, and employees shared stories about Margaret's Kitchen's impact on their lives. Parents talked about reliable access to high-quality family meals. Employees described opportunities for professional development and genuine profit sharing. Suppliers explained how our commitment to local sourcing had strengthened the entire regional food economy, but the most meaningful moment came when Marcus approached me as the evening was ending. "Mom," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." I looked at my son. This man who'd abandoned his values in pursuit of someone else's dreams, who'd traded his birthright for a mess of pottage, who'd learned too late the difference between price and value. "What are you apologizing for, Marcus?" "For underestimating you. For treating you like a burden instead of recognizing you as the incredible woman you've always been. For letting Sarah convince me that family was something to be managed rather than treasured. It was a start, though barely one. Recognition of error wasn't the same as understanding consequences, and apologies weren't the same as amends. "What about Sarah?" I asked. "Does she share your newfound appreciation for family values?" Marcus's face darkened, and I saw pain there that suggested the question had touched something raw. "Sarah thinks this is all temporary. She says you're having a nice moment of success, but that it's not sustainable at your age. She thinks you'll tire of the work and responsibility, that you'll eventually need the kind of security and care that we were trying to provide. Temporary. Not sustainable." Even faced with overwhelming evidence of my capabilities and success, Sarah was still trying to diminish my achievements and maintain her narrative that I was fundamentally incapable of independent living. "And what do you think, Marcus?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking around the convention center where community leaders were still discussing Margaret's Kitchen's impact and praising the vision that had created it. "I think," he said finally, "that I spent so long listening to what Sarah thought I should want that I forgot what I actually valued. I think I traded away the most important things in my life for the sake of impressing people who don't actually care about me. And I think I hurt the person who loved me most in service of someone who only loves what I can provide for her." It was the most honest thing Marcus had said to me in 5 years. The first acknowledgement that Sarah's influence had been destructive rather than developmental. But honesty about past mistakes wasn't the same as commitment to future change. "What are you planning to do with these realizations?" I asked. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "Sarah's already talking about the house renovations again, about converting your old bedroom into office space, about how much better our family life will be now that we have proper privacy and independence. She sees your success as validation, that we made the right choice." Of course she did. In Sarah's worldview, my success proved that evicting me had been beneficial for everyone. I'd been freed to pursue opportunities that were supposedly better suited to my age and circumstances, while they'd been freed to optimize their living space for maximum family functionality. But the real question wasn't whether Sarah would ever acknowledge the cruelty of what they'd done. It was whether Marcus would continue to allow her interpretation of reality to override his own moral instincts. "Marcus," I said gently, "you're 45 years old. You're successful, intelligent, and capable of making your own decisions about what kind of life you want to live and what kind of man you want to be. The question isn't what Sarah thinks about my success or your choices. The question is what you think about the promises you made to your father and the values you once claimed to share. Before he could respond, Sarah appeared at his elbow, dressed in the kind of expensive cocktail dress that was perfectly appropriate for the occasion while somehow making everyone else feel underdressed. "Margaret, congratulations on your award," she said with that practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "What an unexpected turn of events. I have to admit, when Marcus told me about your little restaurant project, I never imagined it would become so prominent." Little restaurant project. Prominent. Even her congratulations were designed to minimize my achievements while acknowledging them just enough to seem gracious. "Thank you, Sarah," I replied with the same professional courtesy I showed difficult customers. It's been rewarding to discover that the skills I developed over 40 years in business were still relevant in today's market. "Oh, absolutely," Sarah agreed, "though I imagine the day-to-day responsibilities must be exhausting for someone your age. Marcus and I were just discussing how important it is to have exit strategies for ventures like this, succession plans, that ensure sustainability regardless of the founder's longevity. Exit strategies, succession plans, longevity." Sarah was already looking for ways to undermine my success by suggesting it was temporary, unsustainable, dependent on my continued health and energy rather than solid business foundations. "Actually," I said, "one of the advantages of building a cooperative business model is that success doesn't depend on any single individual. Our employees are also owners, our suppliers are partners, and our customers are invested in our continued success. It's much more sustainable than traditional hierarchical structures." I saw Marcus's eyes widen slightly as he processed the implications of what I'd said. The business wasn't just successful. It was structured to outlast me, to continue generating value for community stakeholders long after I was gone. It was exactly the kind of legacy-building approach he'd once valued before Sarah convinced him to prioritize short-term wealth accumulation over long-term community impact. "How fascinating," Sarah said, though her tone suggested she found it more threatening than fascinating. "I'm sure that's very idealistic. Though I wonder about the practical challenges of managing so many stakeholders with potentially conflicting interests." "The stakeholders' interests aren't conflicting," I explained patiently. "Employees want meaningful work and fair compensation. Suppliers want reliable customers and prompt payment. Customers want quality products and good service. When you align business practices with those needs, everyone benefits simultaneously." It was Business Ethics 101, the kind of stakeholder theory that used to be taught in MBA programs before shareholder primacy became the dominant paradigm. But Sarah looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language, unable to comprehend how business success could be measured by anything other than profit maximization for owners. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose different approaches work for different situations. Marcus and I are more focused on building wealth that will provide security for our children's futures, college costs, and all the advantages we want to give them. College costs, the advantages we want to give them." Sarah was pivoting to her strongest argument, the suggestion that any criticism of their choices was ultimately criticism of their children's welfare. But I'd spent enough years in business to recognize strategic deflection when I heard it. "Of course, children's welfare is paramount," I agreed. "That's why it's so important for them to see their parents living according to principles they can be proud of, making choices that reflect genuine values rather than expedient calculations." The comment was pointed enough to make Sarah's smile falter momentarily, but she recovered quickly. "Absolutely. We want James and Emma to understand the importance of practical decision-making and strategic thinking." Practical decision-making. Strategic thinking. Even child-rearing had become corporate speak in Sarah's vocabulary, as if parenting were another project to be optimized rather than a relationship to be cherished. The conversation was interrupted by Patricia, who approached with genuine warmth and excitement. "Margaret, The reporter from State Business Journal wants to set up an interview about expansion plans. Apparently, there's interest from investors in Portland and Seattle who want to discuss regional development opportunities. Portland and Seattle. Regional development. What had started as a single restaurant was generating interest from serious business people who recognized sustainable value creation when they saw it. Marcus looked stunned by this revelation, perhaps finally understanding that his mother's little restaurant project was actually attracting attention from major markets and sophisticated investors. "That's wonderful, Patricia," I said. "Schedule something for next week. I'd like to understand what kind of partnerships might align with our values and growth objectives." Growth objectives. I was using Sarah's language deliberately, making it clear that my business success wasn't accidental or temporary, but the result of careful planning and strategic thinking. Sarah's expression had shifted from patronizing tolerance to something approaching concern, perhaps recognizing that my success was becoming too substantial to dismiss as a lucky fluke or temporary aberration. "Well," she said, "it sounds like you're keeping quite busy. I hope you're not overextending yourself. Marcus and I worry about you taking on too much responsibility at this stage of life." At this stage of life. There it was again, the subtle suggestion that age made me inherently less capable, that success in my 70s was somehow less legitimate than success in my 40s or 50s. "I appreciate your concern," I replied, "but I've found that meaningful work is energizing rather than exhausting. When you're building something that serves others and creates genuine value, the responsibility feels like privilege rather than burden." The distinction was crucial, and I saw Marcus register it immediately. Meaningful work versus strategic career. Advancement. Serving others versus accumulating wealth. Creating genuine value versus extracting maximum profit. These were the choices he'd been grappling with, consciously or unconsciously, throughout his marriage to Sarah. "Mom," Marcus said suddenly, "could we talk privately for a few minutes?" Sarah's hand tightened on his arm, a gesture that appeared supportive but contained an unmistakable message about boundaries and loyalties. "Darling, we should probably head home. The babysitter has school tomorrow and it's already getting late." But Marcus gently disengaged from her grip, his expression determined in a way I hadn't seen since before their marriage. "This will just take a few minutes. You could bring the car around?" It was phrased as a suggestion, but it carried the weight of a decision that wasn't open to negotiation. Sarah looked between us with obvious displeasure, perhaps recognizing that her control over Marcus's interactions with me was finally being challenged. "Of course," she said finally, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "I'll be in the parking lot." After Sarah left, Marcus and I moved to a quiet corner of the convention center, away from the remaining reception guests and cleanup crew. "Mom," Marcus began, then stopped, seemingly struggling with how to articulate what he wanted to say. "Take your time," I said gently. "I keep thinking about Dad's funeral," he said finally. "About the promise I made to take care of you. At the time, I thought I knew what that meant. Making sure you had a safe place to live, helping with finances, checking on your health and well-being. Those are all ways of taking care of someone," I agreed. "But I realize now that I was thinking about taking care of you the way you'd take care of a child or an invalid, protecting you from responsibilities and challenges, making decisions for you, managing your life to minimize risks and complications." It was an accurate description of how he'd approached our relationship after David's death, though I doubted he'd recognized the paternalistic assumptions underlying his care at the time. "And now?" I asked. "Now I understand that taking care of someone you love means respecting their autonomy, supporting their choices, celebrating their successes, and trusting their judgment. It means being available when they need help without assuming they're helpless." It was a sophisticated understanding of care that went far beyond Sarah's transactional approach to relationships. But understanding principles was easier than implementing them, especially when implementation required challenging a spouse who'd built her entire marriage around different assumptions. "What are you going to do with this understanding?" I asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking out the convention center windows toward the parking lot where Sarah was undoubtedly waiting with increasing impatience. "I don't know," he admitted. "Everything feels complicated now. Sarah's already pregnant again. We just found out last week. She's talking about needing even more space, about converting the basement into a proper playroom, about optimizing our living situation for 3 children. 3 children. More space requirements. More justification for the choices they'd already made. More reinforcement of the narrative that evicting me had been necessary for their family's welfare. Congratulations on the pregnancy," I said, meaning it despite everything. Children are always a blessing, regardless of circumstances. "Thank you," Marcus said, then added quietly, "I wish Dad could have met his grandchildren. I wish they could grow up knowing the kind of people their grandparents were, the values that built our family." It was the opening I'd been waiting for, the acknowledgement that something precious had been lost when Marcus chose Sarah's vision over his family's legacy. "They still can," I said gently. "Not knowing your father, unfortunately, but understanding the values he represented. Learning about service, gratitude, the importance of lifting others up rather than climbing over them. Those lessons don't have to die with him." "But Sarah thinks—" "Marcus," I interrupted, "you're about to be the father of 3 children. They're going to learn about life by watching your choices, not by listening to your words. The question isn't what Sarah thinks they should learn. It's what kind of example you want to set for them." The truth was stark and undeniable. Marcus's children would grow up believing that family was disposable if it became inconvenient, that elderly parents were burdens to be managed rather than treasures to be cherished, that success was measured by accumulation rather than contribution. Unless Marcus chose to model something different. "I need to think," Marcus said finally, "about a lot of things." "Thinking is good," I agreed. "But thinking without action is just rumination. At some point, you have to decide what kind of man you want to be, and what kind of legacy you want to leave your children." Before Marcus could respond, Sarah appeared at the convention center entrance, her posture radiating impatience and displeasure. Even at a distance, her message was clear. The conversation needed to end, and Marcus needed to choose between his wife's schedule and his mother's company. "I should go," Marcus said, glancing toward Sarah with obvious reluctance. "Yes, you should," I agreed. "But Marcus, the door to Margaret's kitchen is always open, not just for meals, but for conversations about what really matters in life." He squeezed my hand briefly, then walked toward the parking lot and the woman who'd spent 5 years systematically destroying his connection to everything he'd once valued. I watched him go, feeling neither victory nor defeat, but something more, complex, the bittersweet recognition that some lessons can only be learned through experience, some growth can only happen through loss, and some people have to hit bottom before they remember who they used to be. 6 months later, Marcus filed for divorce. The papers were served on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 years after he'd served me eviction papers in the same kitchen where Sarah was now eating breakfast alone, having discovered that the husband she'd molded to serve, her ambitions had finally remembered he'd once been his own man. I learned about the divorce not from Marcus, but from Maria Santos, who'd heard it from her cousin who worked at the courthouse. "He's asking for joint custody but waiving any claim to spousal support," Maria reported. "Apparently, he wants to make sure the children are provided for but doesn't want ongoing financial entanglement. Joint custody suggested Marcus was planning to be an active father, not just a checkbook. Waiving spousal support indicated he was prioritizing Sarah's security over his own convenience. Both choices reflected the values David and I had tried to instill decades earlier: responsibility, generosity, putting others' needs above personal advantage. Marcus came to Margaret's kitchen 3 days after the divorce papers were filed, looking haggard but somehow lighter, as if an enormous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Mom," he said simply, I'd like to talk. About everything. We sat in my small office behind the kitchen, surrounded by the organized chaos of a successful restaurant. Supplier invoices, staff schedules, customer feedback forms, expansion plans. The accoutrements of a life built on purpose rather than pretense. Sarah says I'm having a midlife crisis, Marcus began. That I'm throwing away everything we built together for some nostalgic fantasy about family values that don't actually exist in the real world. What do you say? I asked. I say, I'm finally waking up from someone else's idea of success and remembering what actually makes me happy. I say I'd rather be poor and principled than wealthy and empty. I say I want my children to be proud of their father, not just provided for by him. It was the most honest statement I'd heard from Marcus in 5 years, the clearest expression of his own values rather than Sarah's expectations. What's your plan? I asked. I want to go back to community development work, Marcus said. Real community development, not consulting for developers who want to maximize profits. I want to design affordable housing, accessible community centers, schools that serve working families rather than impressive architectural firms. It was exactly the work he'd been passionate about before Sarah convinced him to pursue more lucrative opportunities. But returning to meaningful work would require accepting lower income, less prestigious clients, and the kind of professional satisfaction that couldn't be measured by bank account balances. And the children? I want them to know their grandmother, Marcus said simply. I want them to learn about service and gratitude and the importance of treating family like treasure rather than liability. I want them to understand that success isn't about what you accumulate, it's about what you contribute. Felt tears threaten for the first time in months. Not tears of sadness, but of relief, recognition, hope. The son I'd raised was still there, underneath the years of Sarah's influence, ready to reclaim his authentic self and build a life based on genuine values rather than borrowed ambitions. There's something else, Marcus continued. I'd like to move back home. Not permanently, he added quickly. But while I'm transitioning careers and establishing joint custody arrangements, the house feels empty and wrong without you, and I think the children should grow up understanding what real family looks like. Move back home. To the house where he'd been raised, where David had died, where I'd been evicted for the crime of growing old in the wrong woman's vision of family life. That house belongs to you now, I reminded him. You can live there if you choose. But I won't be returning as your tenant, Marcus. Those days are over. I know, Marcus said. I want to transfer the deed back to you. It was always your house, and I had no right to take it away from you. Even if you don't want to live there anymore, it should be yours to decide what happens to it. Transfer the deed back. Acknowledge his mistake. Accept responsibility for the harm he'd caused. It was more than an apology. It was restitution, the practical expression of genuine remorse. But Margaret's Kitchen had become more than just a business. It had become my identity, my community, my contribution to the world. Moving back to the house where I'd been a dependent mother-in-law would feel like retreat rather than progress. I appreciate the gesture, I said, but I'm happy where I am. Margaret's Kitchen isn't just my work, it's my legacy. This is where I belong now. Marcus nodded, perhaps understanding that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt exactly as they'd been before. But relationships, like businesses, could be restructured on new foundations that honored past mistakes while building toward better futures. Then maybe, Marcus suggested, we could establish new traditions. Sunday dinners at Margaret's Kitchen instead of at home. The children could grow up understanding your business, learning about entrepreneurship and community service. They could see their grandmother as the accomplished woman she is, rather than the burden their mother taught them to perceive. New traditions, rebuilt relationships, a family structure based on mutual respect rather than obligation or dependency. It wasn't the same as what we'd lost, but it might be something better. A connection based on choice rather than circumstance. Appreciation rather than assumption. I'd like that, I said. 3 years later, Margaret's Kitchen operates 12 locations across 3 states, employs over 200 people, and has been featured in national publications as a model for sustainable, community-focused business development. I'm 76 years old, busier than I've ever been, and more satisfied with my work than I thought possible at this stage of life. Marcus returned to community development and started his own firm specializing in affordable housing and accessible public spaces. His income is half what it was during his marriage to Sarah, but his satisfaction is immeasurable. His children, James, Emma, and 3-year-old David, named for the grandfather he never met, spend every Sunday at Margaret's Kitchen, learning to cook, understanding business operations, and absorbing lessons about service, community, and the difference between worth and wealth. Sarah remarried within 18 months of the divorce, choosing a pharmaceutical executive whose ambitions align perfectly with her vision of success. She moved to Chicago, visits the children monthly, and maintains the same expensive lifestyle she'd built during her marriage to Marcus. By all external measures, she achieved exactly what she'd always wanted: financial security, social status, and freedom from the burden of caring for aging family members. But I think about her sometimes, wondering if she ever reflects on what she lost in her determination to optimize everything around her. The close family relationships she systematically destroyed, the community connections she convinced Marcus to abandon, the sense of purpose that comes from building something meaningful rather than just something profitable. Marcus and I have never discussed the details of his divorce, the property settlements, or Sarah's reaction to losing the life she'd carefully constructed. But I know from observing his children that he's teaching them different values: gratitude instead of entitlement, service instead of accumulation, family loyalty instead of strategic networking. Sometimes when I'm training new employees or meeting with potential partners, I think about the journey that brought me to this point. The grief of widowhood, the betrayal of eviction, the choice to transform suffering into purpose, loss into opportunity, exile into liberation. Margaret's Kitchen exists because Marcus underestimated his mother's capabilities, and Sarah underestimated the consequences of cruelty. Their attempt to reduce me to nothing freed me to become more than I'd ever imagined possible. Their effort to erase my presence from their lives motivated me to build a presence that serves hundreds of families and will outlast all of us. The greatest revenge, it turns out, isn't destruction, it's transformation. Not tearing down what hurt you, but building something so meaningful that the hurt becomes irrelevant. Not proving your enemies wrong, but proving yourself right in ways they never thought to consider. I forgave Marcus not because he deserved it, but because forgiveness freed me to love my grandchildren without reservation and build relationships based on present choices rather than past mistakes. I don't hate Sarah because hatred would have poisoned the success I built from the ashes of her cruelty. But I also don't forget the lessons learned during those dark months when I faced the possibility of being discarded by the child I'd raised, dismissed by the family I'd cherished, reduced to nothing by people who'd benefited from everything I'd given them. I learned that resilience isn't just about surviving difficulty. It's about transforming difficulty into strength. That dignity isn't something others can take from you. It's something you either maintain or surrender through your own choices. That family isn't just about blood relationships. It's about chosen connections based on mutual respect and genuine care. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to begin again, to build something meaningful, to prove that experience and wisdom have value that youth and ambition can't replicate or replace. The wake-up call I gave Marcus and Sarah echoes still, not just in their lives but in the lives of everyone touched by Margaret's Kitchen. Every employee who's learned that work can be meaningful. Every customer who's experienced service based on genuine care. every supplier who's benefited from fair dealing and prompt payment, every community that's been strengthened by locally owned, ethically operated business. The broken old lady they tried to discard became the foundation for an enterprise that serves thousands of people and will continue serving them long after I'm gone. The burden they wanted to eliminate became the leader of a movement that proves business success and community service aren't just compatible, they're inseparable. That's the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge seeks to harm those who've harmed you. Justice seeks to build something so good that harm becomes impossible to inflict on others. Margaret's Kitchen is my justice, and every day I walk through its doors, see its impact on the community, and witness the values it embodies, I'm reminded that the greatest victories aren't won through destruction, but through creation. The wake-up call worked both ways. Marcus woke up to what he'd lost and chose to reclaim his authentic self. Sarah woke up to the consequences of treating people as disposable and learned that some losses can't be optimized away. And I woke up to possibilities I'd never imagined, opportunities that existed beyond the comfortable confines of family obligation and conventional retirement. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is being forced to discover who you really are when everything you thought defined you is stripped away. Sometimes the cruelest rejection becomes the greatest liberation. Sometimes getting kicked out of one life is exactly what you needed to build a better one. And sometimes, when people try to reduce you to nothing, they inadvertently give you the freedom to become everything you were meant to be. The game is over. I won. But more importantly, everyone who walks through Margaret's Kitchen's doors wins too. That's what happens when you build victory on values instead of vengeance, purpose instead of pride, service instead of selfishness. That's the wake-up call that keeps on ringing, transforming ordinary Tuesday mornings into extraordinary opportunities to make the world a little better, one meal at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.